Good morning, everybody. I hope you guys are doing all right. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. Let me adjust the slight one iota. There it is. I think that's a little bit better. Let's go with that. I hope you guys are doing okay this morning. It is Monday. I wish you all a happy belated Thanksgiving. I hope you guys' Thanksgiving has gone well, and that you enjoyed it, whether it was with family, whether you were by yourself, whether you didn't even celebrate Thanksgiving because you're in a different country. I still wish you a good one. There have been power outages here, weirdly enough. Apparently on Wednesday, there was some kind of fire that affected, I was told, the transformer that took down power on Wednesday. And for Thursday and Friday, Thanksgiving, and day after Thanksgiving, I took those 2 days off. So that is why last week was a short week. But we are back to normal this week, up until the point where we get to Christmas, which I will be taking a few days off for Christmas. But that being said, the news hasn't necessarily stopped. I guess the big news over the course of the time frame that we were off, or that I was off, Yermak is out. Zelensky's chief of staff, he is gone. And it seems that things around Zelensky is effectively crumbling, falling apart. Yermak, being one of Zelensky's closest advisors and often understood to be the power within that administration, there was a lot of rumors about whether or not Yermak was going to be out. And a lot of the talk was that Yermak was going to resist, they were going to fight it, he wasn't going anywhere, and then all of a sudden, he's out. And apparently he was screaming, "Send me to the front! Send me to the front. Give me a rifle and a potato and send me to the front." Now, who knows whether that's going to take place? There was even video that was put out. Again, I'm going to put it under the term of rumor that Yermak's area was being investigated by NATO, meaning they were effectively raiding his place. I don't know if that's true yet. I guess that will be confirmed one way or the other a little bit later. Also taking place are negotiations in Florida. Umarov, another person who was targeted by NATO, is having conversations with Witkoff and Rubio in Florida. Now, Rubio came out effectively saying, we've moved the ball, we've made progress, but there have been no agreements that have been reached. Apparently, what the biggest issue has to do with elections that are supposed to be held, or to be held because Russia's not necessarily going to make a deal with Zelensky because he's illegitimate. On top of elections to be held, you also get this notion of territory. And Russia has effectively said, not just said, they've taken the territory, and it's effectively said, this is now part of the Russian Federation. Ukraine obviously doesn't necessarily want to give that territory up, despite the fact that if you look at what's taking place on the ground, I don't know why they think they have a choice in the matter. Nevertheless, negotiations continue. Ukrainians have seemed to be, let's say, obstinate and coming to any kind of terms. Now, this is fascinating on a few fronts. It's fascinating because, as Putin pointed out in his last speech, the deal that Trump has come up with, and there have been multiple versions of it floating around, but the one that we've been exposed to, the one that we have seen, is a basis of negotiation. A basis. It's a dead letter in the way that it's written. And I've kind of pointed that out. I had Jeff Rich on the show to go over it. But it's a dead letter in the way that it's written. One of the provisions is that $100 billion of Russian money is somehow going to go into agreements with the United States where the United States can make a buck off of the war, which is just outrageous, right? There are fewer things that are in that document that are outrageous. So Putin, being the diplomat that he is, this is a basis of negotiation. However, and he pointed out, in the same way that Kupiansk is being, let's say, mopped up, other locations in Ukraine will also be mopped up. And so, look, whether we come to a deal or not is irrelevant to the point that the special military operation continues, and it will continue. I hope you get my point. From the Russian point of view, it's cute that you guys are talking to each other, but we are continuing what we're doing on the battlefield. And more likely than not, this will be settled on the battlefield one way or the other. And the reason why I say one way or the other is because the negotiations in and of themselves, the only reason they exist, the only reason the 28-point plan, despite the fact that it's a debt letter, exists is because of what has been happening on the ground. What's happening on the ground is dictating events and honestly give credence to the Russian strategy, right? I mean, their point of view was we will continue with a special military operation while keeping the door open for diplomacy. And maybe at some point, rationality would kick in and they would knock on that door. They would walk through that door, right? Up to this point, that hasn't necessarily been the case. That being said, despite what is taking place on the ground militarily and Russia's continued advance in Ukraine's continued, as Mark would say, crumbling, and you also get the political situation for Zelensky crumbling, even his number one man being taken out, and the Naboo negotiations, or let's say investigations, seemingly circling around Zelensky himself. You also get the negotiations for Witkoff, supposedly flying from Florida and going to Russia. They have negotiations with Putin. A lot is going on all at once. There's a lot of movement. The other thing that is that has been pretty wild is Donald Trump's threats and attacks on Venezuela. Now, there is reporting that there was a secret conversation. The New York Times was reporting this, I think Wall Street Journal also, that there were secret conversations between Trump and Maduro last week. In those secret conversations, Donald Trump effectively threatened Maduro saying, leave or we will murder a lot of people. Now, I'm saying murder of a lot of people, but I'm saying if you're doing strikes on Venezuela, you're doing it to kill people, right? You've already been murdering people illegally in boats under this fake tinfoil fig leaf of drugs. Now, this is made even more ludicrous with the pardoning of Hernandez. Now, Hernandez, I don't know if you remember this, the United States got rid of Zelaya, put in Hernandez. Hernandez was a literal narco president of Venezuela, of Honduras. He gets extradited to the United States and put in prison. This was under the Biden administration. Now, this is ironic on so many levels, right? We put the guy in. The guy ends up being a narco kingpin saying, I'm going to get cocaine into the nose of every gringo, was one of the quotes. Trump creates a fake premise to go after Venezuela. Part of this has to do with the Russian influence of Venezuela, the Chinese influence of Venezuela, the Iranian influence of Venezuela, and also the natural resources that are in Venezuela. They want to get their hands on it. All right. He creates a fake premise to go after him using drugs, something that everybody knows is fake. And on top of that, starts murdering random people in boats that he claims to be transporting drugs to America. Now, if you have the capability to militarily destroy a boat, you obviously also have the capability of boarding the boat, getting those quote unquote drugs, and prosecuting the people under the law, as opposed to just outright murder. But okay, they've been doing this. I think they killed like 80 people, give or take. So in the secret phone call, Trump has effectively told Maduro, you either leave or else we will start killing a lot of people potentially. Maybe we'll start killing people. Now, for the amount of force that the United States has leveraged in the Caribbean at this point, that seems to be a very hard thing to walk back. Meaning it will be very weird for you to put that much military force in the Caribbean. You've been murdering these people left and right. You get all of this outed in regards to the media saying, I'm threatening to kill a lot of people in Venezuela if Maduro doesn't necessarily leave. For the Trump administration to say, okay, now I'm going to walk this back. Maduro didn't leave. Nothing took place. So then we're going to walk this back. That seems like that's a hard dog to walk. That seems like it's a very difficult thing for you to actually pull back on and lose that much face in the process of making all of these threats and then walking all of this back, including the amount of military arsenals that you've effectively put into this region. It seems as if Trump is going to go through with some kind of military strikes on Venezuela with some idea of regime change. That's a risk. That's a big risk. Does that include putting ground forces, for example? How far do you plan to go with this? Is it just military strikes? Is it decapitation strikes? Are you putting U.S. military on the ground in Venezuela itself? How far do you plan to go with this? None of this is legal, by the way. All of this is just fiction. Now, the wild part about it is for the Democrats who are screaming about this, and very few are, from my view of this, Obama was doing something very similar in the Middle East. Now, if you remember, Obama had a kill list where he would go through and murder people on his own, including at one point, 2 Americans, or at the very least, Americans and their kids. Now, the reason why I'm pointing this out is that what Donald Trump is doing, the difference is one is taking place in the Caribbean, the other one was taking place in the Middle East. When Obama was trying to overthrow the Syrian government, okay, is there really a dramatic difference between Obama putting billions of dollars and overthrowing the Syrian government and Donald Trump investing resources and overthrowing the Venezuelan government? Yes, they're in different parts of the world, but it's still a president that is asserting a certain amount of authority to take actions that obviously are uncouth. You can make a case that says illegal under international law, but as I keep pointing out, international law obviously doesn't exist. So that is the situation to which we are presented with. That is what is taking place right now in Venezuela. Now, Maduro said these are lies, that this didn't take place. But who knows? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I mean, fact of the matter is, if you're looking at media and the way that the media operates, media is putting out reports that Europe is saying we are going to have preemptive war or preemptive strikes on Russia. And then they say preemptive strikes for defensive reasons. And the entire article effectively uses stuff that is absolutely fake. Oh, the Russians are flying drones in areas, even though we couldn't confirm that these were Russian drones. The Russians were firing missiles into locations, even though we've figured out that these weren't really Russian missiles, or that the drones that were flying, that Russia alerted that were flying in Poland, didn't necessarily have any armaments or anything associated with it. Meaning they are using fake stuff, false flags, in order to come up with some kind of justification to make the argument we're doing preemptive attacks. The point I'm making here is the way that the media is effectively reporting this. You're giving all of these quotes from lunatics and goofballs in Europe. Kalis, for example, who is just beautiful and dumb, as I keep pointing out. None of the stuff has substance. The entire point of the article is to be a vehicle for European leaders that have no influence in the negotiations, they have no power, they have no swords, to effectively dump all of this chum into the water that is utter and complete nonsense. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is if Maduro is screaming, this conversation never took place, maybe he's right. Maybe he's not. Nobody knows. On some level, this stuff comes across as a circus. And it would be a circus, would not be for over 1 million people dead in Ukraine and the number of people that Donald Trump is planning to murder in Venezuela in order to overthrow the Maduro government. It's outrageous. It's outrageous. Outrageous is an understatement. But my man is here. I see him in the background, getting a sip of coffee, giving him time to get that sip. And we are joined with the one and only Mark Sleboda. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. How you doing, Mark? You doing okay this morning? Well, this afternoon for you.
Tomorrow, I'm alive. How the hell are you? Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show. And iced tea because it's afternoon here, not morning.
I see. See, I drink coffee all day. So fair enough. Fair enough. I'm wired at like 8 o'clock at night. Well, thank you for joining me, man. You guys can, by the way, can follow Mark on Boosty, Boosty, under Real Politic with Mark Sleboda, or if you just put in his name, Mark will appear. Definitely check out his work. Definitely check out his content. All of his interviews and everything else show up on Boosty. He is a fantastic analyst, and he has been a damn good friend of the show. Mark, so your mic is out. Negotiations have continued in Florida. Apparently, Witkoff is even flying to Russia. Witkoff is apparently going to be talking to Putin. Putin has already said that the quote-unquote 28-point dead letter is a basis of negotiations. What do you make of this? I mean, the fact that Naboo is seemingly getting closer to Zelensky. The U.S. is seemingly pressuring Ukraine to accept territorial concessions. Yermak is out,
Mhm.
Zelensky's closest advisor, and now you have Witkoff going to Moscow. What does this mean, or does it mean anything?
Nope, doesn't mean anything.
Oh,
it
fair
doesn't
enough.
mean anything. It's
Mark
background.
Sleboda internationally.
That's it. Out of here. No, I don't. I do believe that the Trump administration, all right, or whatever levers it controls, through intelligence to NABU and SAPO, these anti-corruption watchdogs that the U.S. and EU set up and still control. Obviously, the commanding heights of. Now, they're no longer funded by the U.S. They were funded in part by U.S. aid, and Trump killed that. My
Right.
understanding is that the Europeans have picked up the bill for NABU and SAPO since then. However, either some U.S. money is still going, under the covers to there, or the U.S. retains leverage despite the bills being paid by the Europeans, which is entirely possible. But the fact that Yermak, Andrei Yermak, the Kiev regime's Grey Cardinal chief of staff, considered by some the most powerful man politically in Ukraine, often put together in a this bromance collocation with Zelensky Zermak. Weird, disturbing comments by Zelensky that they sometimes even sleep in the same room.
Really?
Yes. Presumably in a bunker somewhere, I guess. They're so close that they often sleep in the same room. Their work is so close together. Yeah, that was a little disturbing. But anyway, I'm not going to judge.
Yeah.
Yermak, he came out of the Geneva talks last weekend between the Kiev regime and the U.S. and loudly proclaimed that the Trump's 28-point plan was extinct, that it no longer existed, that it was pointless to talking about it, effectively claiming victory over Trump, right? That is essentially what he did. And he did this quite loudly. He gave a long interview with Simon Schuster in The Atlantic, and to this effect. And the next day, his house is being raided by NABU, these anti-corruption, police. And it's, I'm sure he didn't have anything in his home, right? That's not the point. The point is the public spectacle, right? That he is now anathema. And that made Zelensky fire him, right? In what is supposedly was a very unpleasant, vociferous screaming match between Zelensky and Yermak, now coming out according to Ukrainian Telegram channels. And Yermak feels betrayed by Zelensky and by everyone else, that no one came out to defend him. But it was quite obvious that he overstepped his bounds as far as Trump or people within the Trump administration are concerned. Regardless of the destiny of these or non-destiny of these negotiations. But we already had the word a couple of months ago in Politico that the Trump administration was not happy with Yermak, that they felt he was an obstacle. To whatever, they just didn't like him. This is really, I think, been a long time coming. The Europeans are not happy by any of this. They don't like their pet regime being, everyone knows it's corrupt, but you're not supposed to say that out loud, especially not at a time when it's such a precarious situation, with the front line collapsing in or at least crumbling in the Donbass. and everywhere else really, and in the economic situation, facing absolute catastrophe on the precipice early next year, with the Europeans simply not able to come up with the money on their own to keep this regime afloat. Why their obsession with stealing Russia's money in order to keep it up for another year, maybe a year and a half. That's all that money would do. But yeah, so it's going to be a bit of a political earthquake in Kiev. Now, I believe that this is a combination. First of all, it had to happen with the green light from the U.S. Nothing happens, quote unquote, politically. I mean, we can't speak of normal politics in the Kiev regime, of course, but within the Maidan regime milieu, Zelensky's enemies have long been, shall we say, grumbling and gathering force, but they couldn't do anything without a green light from the U.S. because the regime that they would inherit, if Zelensky went away, can't survive without U.S. Political, military, intelligence support, right? Even at the lesser degree that it is receiving now under the Trump administration than the Biden administration. So we're talking, first of all, Zelensky's prior oligarch patron, Igor Kolomoisky, who owned Channel 5, which is where Zelensky's comedy show, The Servant of the People, which then became the name of his political party. He played a hapless school teacher who accidentally became the president of Ukraine and fought corruption and brought peace to the country and all of these other things. It was actually on Netflix for a while. I don't know if it still is. Yeah, but yeah, you could watch it with subtitles on Netflix. I don't know if it's still there. But, that was obviously this meta thing. And then it was decided, wow, he did so great on the TV show. Let's make him president and play, have him play a role. And so the fiction became the reality. And this, at the time, it was viewed as giving Kolomoisky largely control over the country, which is nothing new. I mean, Ukrainian politics since the dissolution of the Soviet Union has been about, competition between the various oligarchs, which television stations they control, which politicians they control, which, corruption feeding troughs of government money they control, that sort of thing. However, somewhere along the line, Zelensky separated himself, probably under U.S. urging, from Kolomoisky, and subsequently legal, the force of the law was brought against Kolomoisky, because law is a political weapon in Ukraine entirely.
Right.
And he is still in and out of court and was laughing over the last couple of weeks and loudly proclaiming to journalists that Zelensky is done, that he called him Napoleon the Fourth, because on another comedy show on comedy feature on Kolomoisky's Channel 5 in Ukraine, Zelensky played Napoleon. And evidently, that's the way that Kolomoisky saw him. So he was saying that he's dead, that he's gone, and he was very much gloating over it to the cameras. So he was definitely involved in this on the domestic level at some point. But also the former oligarch president, the candy oligarch president of the Kiev regime that Zelensky replaced, Petro Poroshenko, who still dreams of resuming power and was always preferred, definitely by the Europeans, and Klitschko, Vitaly Klitschko, the former boxer, Maidan figurehead, one of the Maidan figureheads, who has since the Maidan been the mayor of Kiev, and whom has, he's outright been calling Zelensky a dictator for a couple of years now, which is hilarious because I mean, there was never any problem when they banned 21 political parties of the left, pro-Russian opposition, and silenced the media in East Ukraine and lustrated the parties and drove them all out of the country and everything like that. But then he consolidated all the power. Him and Yermak consolidated all the power in their own, all the power of the regime within their own hands. And then suddenly he becomes a dictator, according to Klitschko. Anyway, the revolution will eat itself, right? That's so they're definitely involved in this, and probably another oligarch or two, because they're always in the mix there. But nothing could be done without the green light from the U.S. And as soon as Yermak overstepped his bounds, obviously that light came, and the next day his apartment was raided in a very public display. And the day after that, I mean, hours after that, actually, he was gone. And the announcement came from Zelensky on Friday evening local time. So it's going to be major political instability. I mean, he ran things, he manipulated events behind the scene. And now, first of all, there'll be competition to replace him, but no one imagines that anyone will have as much power as he did before. And he also, of course, controlled the corruption trough. Now, the interesting thing is he was put in charge of the negotiations with the U.S. along with Rustem Umarov. Rustem Umarov is the former defense minister, still the head of the Kiev regime's National Security and Defense Council. And he was equally implicated in all of these corruption scandals, with Timur Bindich being the head, but all of them involved as well. And he's still untouched for the moment. The green light hasn't gone on for him, so he will still be heading up the negotiations in the U.S. this week. Only Yermak is now going to be replaced by everyone's favorite genocidal sociopath, Krylu, I like the dark Budanov. Which, I'm sorry, that does not make me at all. I mean, I know he is the U.S.'s creature. It is the creature of U.S. intelligence. They brought him up, right, when they started, as they gloat, rebuilding the Ukraine's intelligence agencies as weapons against Russia from the grounds up, according to the New York Times. And, particularly with the military intelligence, the GUR, Budanov was their creature. But that doesn't mean that he's politically loyal to Trump. Right, he's a creature of U.S. intelligence, and he's a Banderite through and through. So there's no hope of him agreeing. I think I can't imagine any more than Yermak to anything that comes through there.
Wait, just to be clear, that's been confirmed. He's taken over chief of staff.
No, he's not taking over chief of staff. He's taking over as co-head of the negotiations with the U.S. for Trump's peace push.
Okay.
Yeah. No, he's not. He's, as far as I know, he's not being considered for chief of staff. He's
okay.
I get where he is. I could see him, the U.S., replacing Zelensky at some point down the road with him one day, possibly. But anyway,
really,
yeah. I mean, they like him, or use intelligence. I don't know if Trump does, but anyway. One of the interesting things with Yermak is in these Nabu wiretaps, right? These tapes. One of the central figures that obviously through the tapes controlled the flow of corruption money and decided who got what was a figure they referred to as Alibaba, right? As a genie, a magic genie who controlled the money. And it just so happens that Yermak's first and middle and patronymic middle name are Andrei Borisovich, A.B. Alibaba. You get it, right? So the genie of corruption is gone. It's going to be Zelensky. All sorts of new knives will be out, in Kiev against him. He'll have less control than he did before, almost certainly, and he will not be replaced until the green light is given by the U.S. for that, right? That is they control everything ultimately. The Europeans may whine and scream and do all the hugging and photo ops with Zelensky, but the U.S. still controls things there. But it's a great degree of political destabilization. However, if the intended purpose is to get the regime, still headed by Zelensky, to agree to U.S. demands to end this conflict on Trump's terms, I don't think that they're going to do that. I don't think they're really going to. They're going to try and still squirm and weave and dodge, and they're not going to want to agree to anything. Ultimately, they will try to pass the buck to Russia, and that's already what we're hearing from Politico. That Trump is effectively giving up with Ukraine for the moment and now wants to take it to Russia and then come back to Ukraine, which of course will suit the Kiev regime and the Europeans perfectly. That's exactly what they want, because they know whatever the nonsense being put out in the mainstream media that this is Russia's plan and it was authored by Kirill Dmitriev and it's a wish list for Russia, it doesn't come close to meeting the minimal demands for Russia. And Russia, Putin has said, it's talking points. It's not an agreement, right? And I mean, basically, it looks like it was written on the back of a restaurant napkin.
It does. It really does.
Right? And so they're trying to be nice about it. Of course, they were happy with the Kiev regime being put in the position of refusing it, right? Because that's the game, as it was with the previous rounds of peace that we've been through before, pushed by Trump, for an ending of the conflict on American terms. It became a blame game. Who takes the blame in Trump's head for it not working? Right. That's what it is. That's what the game is all about now. And if now the focus of the negotiations moves to Russia first, instead of, it is a logical step to get the ducks on your own side in order. And Trump has utterly failed to do that. He has failed to do that with the Kiev regime. Yes, he took Yermak's head, but there's been no signal that Zelensky suddenly going to roll over. He's a proxy, but he still has agency on this kind of things, primarily because the rest of the U.S. power structures, other than the figurehead of president, doesn't agree with any of this, right? Both parties, right? Bipartisan Congress consensus, the deep state, the Pentagon, the military-industrial complex, right? The intelligence services, the media, right? They're all against all of this. So that's why, despite Trump wanting Zelensky to do this, wanting the regime in Kiev to do this, they're still able to say no, despite being a proxy of the U.S., because the president of the U.S. is going against the flow of U.S. foreign policy orthodoxy as determined by the deep state in pursuit of U.S. global hegemony and primacy along approved lines that includes continual tension and conflict with Russia. And Trump just is not allowed to divert from that path. And he has, at the end of the day, he has very little powers to do so. So that's why everything is failing on the U.S. end. And the Europeans have just absolutely refused. They're being more circumspect about it than the Kiev regime is, but they're wisely keeping their mouths shut, and they're hoping that this poison cup of refusal passes to Russia, right? That's what they're hoping, and that's, at least according to reports I've seen on Politico today, that's where the Trump administration is now. They're going to focus the efforts going forward. They're going to give up on Kiev and Europe and go to Russia. And Russia's going to make nice noises and says, yes, this is very, very nice. You've done very well. You have a few spelling mistakes in English here, but and this is a great talking points. It can be the beginning of serious negotiations, which this is not, and we can go over every point literally word for word was their things. But this is not going to be something that they just agreed to, right? If Russia will try not to say "niet" to this, right? Because they don't want that poison cup either. Instead, they will do what they've done in previous such pushes, is make, mildly nice noises and say that it is constructive and blah, blah, blah. And then they will continue on the battlefield and drag it out for months, if not years, until Trump gets tired and throws up his hands and walks away. And the blame then may or may not fall on Russia, but it's less direct than them saying no. So that's what's going to happen. I still don't see that the Europeans are actually now frothing mad for war with Russia. We had a NATO official this last just over the weekend give an interview say where they're considering preemptive strikes for deterrence on Russia. Right? They've got to bring the conflict to Russia, like they haven't been waging a conflict against Russia for the last few years. But of course, that proxy conflict has not worked out for them. So they don't accept the results. The entirety of the U.S. state, beyond Trump and Vance and Witkoff, doesn't accept it. The Kiev regime doesn't accept it. And Russia doesn't accept it because the terms are not agreeable to them. As far as they're concerned, they're not willing to make any concessions. In fact, there's growing feelings they're talking regime change in the Kremlin. They're talking war crime tribunals for the Kiev leadership. They're not making any concession noises. That's for sure.
They've hardened their position.
No one's ready yet, right? Everyone wants peace in Ukraine
on their terms.
On their terms. And no one wants peace in Ukraine unless it's on their terms. And as bad as things are for Kiev on the battlefield, no one is ready to throw in the towel yet, except for Trump, right? A group of people around Trump, they have other priorities. They want to kind of half stop this, half dump it off on Europe. They want to preserve their anti-Russian client state in Kiev. So they want to end it now on whatever terms they can get that preserves that, right? They still think that they can push Russia to away from, what is depicted in the Western media as maximalist demands, which, as far as Russia is concerned, are actually minimalist demands. But anyway, it's still not going to go anywhere. No one agrees to it. So it's all, this is all noise. This is a circle jerk. In fact, Putin spoke last week at a collective security treaty organization meeting in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. He spoke to the press afterwards. And he said the big problem with negotiations is that the West isn't in agreement, right? That there's no agreement between the U.S. and the Kiev regime and the Europeans. And he even pointed out there's no agreement within the U.S. government, that there's division within the, and that's exactly what it is, right? They keep arguing amongst themselves. There's no agreement, right? There's no consensus position. Not even within the Trump administration itself, right? I mean, they had to get rid of Kellogg now because I guess he was the loudest voice in opposition. And they've replaced him with the U.S. Army Secretary, a very strange choice, Daniel Driscoll, until you find out that Driscoll is a university friend. They went to Yale Law School together with Vance, and that Driscoll kind of had a failed political career up until he was appointed Army Secretary by Trump Vance, right? They was brought into the campaign and then that. So he's a political loyalist to Vance and Trump. And that's why he's being used here. Much like why Witkoff is being used instead of someone from the State Department, instead of Marco Rubio, right? Because they don't trust the deep state. They don't trust the geopolitical, ideological baggage, right, that comes with people that emerge out of those structures. So instead, they choose complete amateurs, right? And that shows in the documents that have been crafted. But this is also a problem in and of its own, because Russia is demanding not a handshake and a backroom agreement between friends, something like this. This is a great power world order shaping treaty that would end this conflict. And it has to be done with very formalized procedures that will give some type of public and legal guarantee. Although, I still wouldn't
I don't know what that means.
wipe my butt with it, right?
Yeah.
But they demanding a formalized Cold War style, negotiations with teams that in exhausting detail go over everything. A handshake and a nod and some type of mafia agreement with Trump is just not going to cut it. And Putin said, again, this is not only the way I want it. This is not only the way it's always been done. It's the only way to go about it, right? This is not the U.S. dictating, tariff terms to some little South American country or even one of its vassal states. This is great power geopolitics, treaty writing, and they're going to demand a very high level of formalization of this. And the Trump administration is simply not capable of this, right? The U.S. has fallen out of the whole habit since the Cold War. The State Department is, I don't know if they retain the professional capability. They certainly don't have the ideological disposition, which is why they're not being used. But Trump's people, right? Trump doesn't have the patience. He doesn't have the attention span. He doesn't have the political capital. And his people that he's using, these are, as far as Russia is concerned, informal contacts. They're nice.
Right.
They're what is referred to as backdoor negotiation, back channel negotiations, right? Witkoff, and Dmitriev and but they're not formal diplomatic negotiating teams. And at the end of the day, they don't cut the mustard. So the Trump administration is going to lose to their demands on every front, on this pursuit of this project to end it on terms that are, have enough sweeteners as far as they're concerned that Russia should agree to it, but still preserves a U.S. client regime in Kiev. But they're not capable of pushing it through. They don't have the support of the Europeans. They don't have the support of the Kiev regime. They don't have the support of anyone else in the U.S., of all the other institutions of government. They don't even have support within Trump's own administration for it, right? I'm sure Mark Rubio is just being shuffled off to the side. We'll let you drive everything in Venezuela. Just don't be concerned about this, right? I mean, that seems to be the division of labor there that has been, Marco Rubio, whenever asked by the media about anything with Ukraine, he looks like a deer caught in the headlights. Like he doesn't want to say what he really
obviously it's not for it. Yeah.
He doesn't want anything to do with it. So, but they don't have the ability to carry this through. They don't have the leverage over even the Kiev regime, right? Despite effectively sculpting Yermak over this, I still don't see. There was an interview over the weekend also with Zaluzhny, the Kiev regime's former military head, whom was seen as a political rival to Zelensky and has since being fired, been in been in political exile as ambassador to the UK. But he gave an interview this weekend saying openly, well, I mean, we can agree to a temporary end to this conflict, but ultimately what we want is the destruction of the Russian Empire, and anything will just be a pause until that. And one way of giving Ukraine security guarantees would be us getting nuclear weapons, right? I mean, can you imagine what they're thinking in the Kremlin?
Lindsey Graham knocked that down.
This is the only one that they're considering as a possibility of ever replacing Zelensky with. And as I've long said, he's no better by far. There's no one that can emerge out of the Maidan that is capable of coming to any type of diplomatic settlement, at least a long-term diplomatic settlement with Russia, which is why ultimately, whether they want to or not, the Kremlin will be forced to regime change Kiev and go all the way, possibly, certainly to Kiev, possibly to the Polish border, however long that may take.
I saw the well, two things. One, I agree with you. Let's say the device in the United States that would have allowed these kind of long-term negotiations has been frayed with hegemonic norms. Like, meaning under normal circumstances, the U.S. give dictates, not sit down and actually hammer out and negotiate a deal. We're just, it's not something that we necessarily do. So this is kind of a new muscle.
The abilities to conduct those were lost during the long drunken period of the unipolar movement, and they no longer have either the mental predisposition or the professional capabilities necessary to do that type of high-level negotiation.
Yeah. The other one you mentioned, Admiral Gillespie, what is it? Gillespie Cavo-Dragon, I believe, head of NATO's military committee. And he was the one that told Financial. He's the one that told Financial Times that we need to do preemptive strikes for defensive reasons against Russia's hybrid war. That article was completely absurd. Politico did a secondary, like a follow-up, and it was just a vehicle for empty quotes by all of these European leaders for things.
But it shows you their mentality, though. They're just not. I mean, they're not in a end the conflict terms. They're in a desperation and escalate the conflict terms. Again, they're living in a fantasy world. They can't accept the way things have turned out. And that is a very dangerous position. The entire way that they understand the world and their place in it, according to the supremacist messianic ideology of Western exceptionalism, is challenged by what has happened, and they can't accept that. It challenges their very identity, who they believe they are, and their place in the world. They cannot accept it, which is, it's a very dangerous position, because both sides ultimately, right, even if the weapons are mostly in the U.S. hands, are the nuclear-powered superpowers of the world. And any direct conflict, right? I mean, let's face it, the West, NATO and Russia have been in conflict for at least the last 4 years. But it has still been a conflict largely conducted in the shadows, right, as it were, at least where it's not openly recognized. And most of the West's power has been through the thin proxy of Kiev. But the US and the UK and France have openly fired, with their own personnel, invariably fired ballistic missiles into Russia. It's just, I don't see this. I don't see how this ends diplomatically. I don't see how this ends diplomatically, which means I don't see how it ends in the long. We can talk about conflict petering off. We can talk about frozen conflict. We can talk about guerrilla conflict and dirty war at the end of it. But as I said in February of 2022, this is a forever war. And I do not expect that Ukraine will truly know peace, that there will be conflict of some kind. The absolute best we could hope for is a renewed cold come hot war with Europe coming out of this. Russia hoped, when they began this conflict, that the Europeans and the Americans would come to their senses, and some type of new Cold War style peace agreement for security, some type of, adults in the room coming to the fore to, out of self-preservation and mutually assured destruction, if nothing else, come to terms with Russia, and that some level of normalization and resumption of economic activity would return. right? Some level of return to normal. That's never going to happen. Never going to happen. It's just, you would need a complete change in the political ideologies and institutions of both Europe and the United States. And that's not anywhere in the cards.
Well, there's also the problem of what does NATO mean if the major conflict that it gets involved in, it just fundamentally loses. Like it challenges the identity of the organization.
Yeah,
itself.
It challenges U.S.-led Western global hegemony. And that was said openly by Boris Johnson, who said that hegemony is at risk. In many other terms, by Mark Milley and others, it has been framed in slightly more, politically ameliorative terms, like U.S. global leadership is on the line. But they see that rightly, this is a world order shaping conflict. If U.S. and NATO lose this, or are perceived as losing this, then that will call their hegemonic power into question, because ultimately hegemony at some level is about fear and belief, right? It is to some degree, there has to be hard power aspects, right? There has to be soft power aspects, but ultimately it's narrative, right? That
power is the shadow on the wall.
Ties it all together. And if people saw Russia effectively, after they declared that NATO must win this war against Russia very loudly from the roof, and they don't, and Russia is perceived as winning, right? Then the whole rotten edifice, and how will you convince? And they talk all the time, it will embolden China to retake their own island province of Taiwan from Western-backed separatists. But how the media has to spin the whole situation around Taiwan a certain way. So, but to a degree, they're right. I mean, not that China would be emboldened one way or another, but ultimately, yes, hegemony will be called into question, not just by China, but by countries around the world. And already, the U.S. has failed to corral the rest of the world to follow their existential economic war of sanctions against Russia. Outside the West, the rest of the world refused, right? They either outright said no, or they and then found workarounds and continued trade with Russia anyway, which is, like where India's at. China says no, right? India says, what'd you say? Middleman. Russian oil flow continues, right? That's where the whole world is at, right? And that is already world order changing, right? The hegemon has failed, right? That old line, my favorite line from Star Wars: A New Hope, the first Star Wars movie, where Princess Leia tells Grand Moff Tarkin, the more you try to tighten your grip, the more star systems will slip through your fingers, something along those lines. And that's what's happening here. So Russia has already won the diplomatic war.
I like the Game of Thrones.
They're winning the economic and military war, but they've already won the diplomatic war.
Power is a shadow on the wall. And this idea that power is where people think power resides, and if that ever gets challenged,
you're both quoting their ancient Greek political philosophers and George R.R. Martin.
Yeah, right. I just love that line. Power is a shadow on the wall. I love that line.
Well, that's back to the ancient Greek philosophers. The power believes it resides where men believes it resides. Was that Varys in the Game of Thrones?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, Varys. Yeah. I love that.
It's a realist truism, right? It is.
Yeah. It's very true. Until it's challenged, it's where people think it is, right? One of the other things, the tankers.
If you want to think of it in those terms, the conflict right now, the geopolitical conflict, you could say it's a Game of Thrones. Not that Russia can hope to take the throne, but they can hope to place China on it and themselves as the hand, if you want to look at it in those terms,
hand of the king,
rather than
the US. Thing. The tankers that have been hit is fascinating to me Now, these weren't Russian ships.
They
Kazakhstan
were
is putting in
Gambian
protest.
flagged and owned ships.
Exactly. And so Ukraine has decided to bomb tankers from effectively other countries under the idea of what? Gaining some kind of leverage because they've lost the war on the ground? This seems insane to me.
Desperation and spite. Not only have they lost the world in the ground, but it's also a recognition that their plan, backed by the U.S., as the New York Times has admitted, of a long-range drone strike campaign to destroy Russia's oil refining capacity has also failed, right?
Yeah.
So now they're moving to something new, a new escalation. They're going after the quote-unquote shadow fleet, right? And once again, the shadow fleet isn't some, I don't know, Babylon 5, sci-fi, whatever, right? I always love the terminology. It's absolutely hilarious. As soon as anyone in the Western media utters the word shadow fleet with anything other than risible, scare quotations around it, they're a complete propagandist, right? I mean, there's just no question. But it is though. So there's only a minority of ships, right? I mean, more than before the conflict, but there's only a minority of ships that are Russian-owned, Russian-flagged ships. It's just the world's maritime oil shipping industry that is not directly insuranced anymore by London, and so outside of their direct control, and they see money to be made. That's all what it is. It's money to be made. They have ships. Russia has oil that needs shipped somewhere. Someone wants that oil. They see money to be made, right? And that's why they come. That's why these Gambian flag tankers are there. That is the world energy market defying, U.S., but there's no specific sanctions again. They try to pinpoint individual ships, which is whack-a-mole. They just changed the name of the ships and the flag, the flag of, of convenience that it's flown under and whatever. But, people are going to make money. Capitalists be capitalists.
Right.
But, we've been through conflict in the Black Sea before, which I have regarded as fairly inconclusive. We've had two versions of grain deals, right, which are about Black Sea shipping that have gone down, and there was still effectively a tacit agreement that shipping on both sides remains untouched, right? Even Russia hasn't targeted the obvious NATO shipping of arms and supplies coming up through the Turkish-controlled Dardanelles, up the coast of Romania and Bulgaria, and then sneaking around into Odessa and ports there on the Dnieper. They may hit them in port. They've hit the ports repeatedly, right? But they largely didn't interfere with the shipping. There are diplomatic reasons for that, as well as there are practical military reasons for that, right? But this is a new escalation because two, again, Gambian flag tankers, right, operating as part of the shadow fleet without being owned by Russia, if you want to call it that way. They were on their way from Turkish waters to Novorossiysk, to the Russian port there. They were not carrying oil at the time they were hit, right? Which, okay, so the environmental, it's not an absolute catastrophe, the way it could have been otherwise. But, who knows what's going to happen in the future. But they were hit by these unmanned USVs, unmanned surface vehicles. The Kiev regime put out videos of them using these vehicles to hit the tankers. So there's no question about what happened or who was responsible. But these two ships at least were damaged. And there is a third ship, a Turkish flagged ship that has carried Russian oil before, may have been carrying it at the time, that is now sinking off the coast of Senegal. That may also, maybe they had a magnetic mine attached. We don't know what the exact situation is. But two, possibly even three ships targeted now. On top of that, they hit the energy energy facilities at the port of Novorossiysk that were owned by the Caspian Sea Pipeline Consortium, of which that's the majority of oil that flows through that is actually from Kazakhstan.
Right.
And Kazakhstan has decidedly stayed neutral, more or less, in the same way, that other countries have. They still continue trade with Russia, despite Western demands to do otherwise, but they also trade with Ukraine, and they don't actively participate on Russia's side in this, or the Kiev regime's side. But this is definitely an attack on them. 20% of their oil exports went through this pipeline, and I have not seen any definitive assessment of the damage. I saw initial reports that said, quote, damage beyond repair, but I haven't seen anything definitive after that. So that's not confirmed.
Don't quote on that.
Yeah. I mean, you can quote whoever was quoted on that, but that doesn't mean that it's true, right? We need some satellite and other assessment and other things. But here's the thing. The Caspian Sea Pipeline Consortium, yes, some Russian energy companies are invested to a certain amount in that, and some Russian energy does go through those pipelines. But the U.S. energy majors are also heavily invested in the Caspian Sea Pipeline Consortium. So that is an effective strike against the United States. Now, pure speculation on my part, but let's say Zelensky, other figures in Kiev, a little peeved at the U.S. pushing them, trying to push them towards diplomacy, taking Yermak's head, decide to lash out and hit a pipeline that is in part owned by American energy interests. Possibility. All I'm saying, I certainly believe the Kiev regime is capable of that type of stupid, spiteful act. They can't but know that the U.S.'s energy companies are heavily in. I mean, that's not something that can be denied, and they chose to hit it anyway. At this point in time, you do the logic chains as you said. Speculation, no evidence yet, but I mean, what kind of evidence would there be of that unless someone opened their mouth? So anyway, it's a huge new escalation. Obviously, shipping costs for Russian energy are going to go up, right? Insurance is going to go up, whether it's Russian insurance or Arab insurance or, Southeast Asian insurance, right? Ship captains are not going to want to put their ships at risk if these types of attacks continue, right? So there will be fewer ships willing to participate in this shadow fleet trade, right? So it's going to create problems for Russia. There's no question about that. Is it a problem that is going to be, it'll bring Russia to their knees? No, right? At the very worst, they'll redirect their energy as much as possible out of the Black Sea. Now, Russia does have other options. One, they could convoy energy tankers moving through the Black Sea, as they have threatened to do and did at least once in the Baltic. Problems with that is the Kiev regime still has a regular amount of NATO supplied unmanned surface vehicles, and that then puts their Navy ships at risk. And the Russian Black Sea fleet has effectively been sidelined in this conflict, right? The Russia just sees no reason to put them to sea when they're not going to attempt to shut down the Black Sea trade. And defenses against unmanned surface vehicles, these drone boats, suicide boats, are not guaranteed. And Russia has lost, or at least had damaged, some very expensive ships for not a good exchange, right? If we're talking, cost-effective war of attrition, type math. So that would be once again putting some of their surface ships at risk, escorting ships, and that may have been part of the reason to lure them out of the ports in the eastern Black Sea at Novorossiysk back to where they could be targeted more regularly again. That may be at least part of the logic behind this. Now, Russia has other military options. They can shut trade down to Ukrainian ports. All they have to do is flood Odessa with sea mines. They can do that.
Why don't they do that? I mean, as a response.
Because of the diplomatic, the global South, with the grain deals and everything, countries in Africa, right? Even if the grain that Russia, the Kiev regime, that Ukraine provides to the global energy markets is, a fraction, a fourth or a fifth or whatever of what Russia provides. It's still important for the global food markets. It would raise costs for everything. And all of the African countries, they live, not all of them, but a lot of them still have, are constantly dealing with the threat of overpopulation and malnutrition and not enough economy. So in order to keep the rest of the world on side, or at least on the sides of this conflict, Russia agreed not to inhibit the Kiev regime's grain trade through the Black Sea by such easy methods as sea mines, which they could do very quickly if they wanted to. And I don't believe they're going to do that again now. Maybe if things escalate further, it becomes a regular, that argument will come more to the fore. Right now, Russia's going to probably do nothing. I mean, they'll launch probably some drone and missile strikes against Odessa, they say, where these unmanned surface vehicles could have been launched from. And maybe they could. They hunt them, regularly whenever they can find them. I'm sure the British Navy, officers were involved in this because they've been involved in planning everything. They imagine some type of Crimean war. They seem to think, if you read the British reports, gloating and glowing about the role they've played in the defeat of Russia on the Black Sea, which is way overblown. At best, it's been inconclusive. But you can bet that they are involved in this. That is a certainty as far as I'm concerned. I don't even think it's a matter of speculation. They've been involved in planning and directing everything that has happened on the Black Sea up until now, and openly admitted it. I see no reason why that would have changed. So they're definitely involved in all of this. But at this point, Russia is going to very much limit their response. Again, missile and drone strikes in Odessa on the coast there, hitting maybe some NATO people, some places. But the problem is these boats can be launched from, just about anywhere. It's difficult. But it will require, this would have to become systematic. It would have to become a regular part of the conflict, and the costs would have to rack up both in perception terms and economic terms for Russia to take more decisive action than that. And because it would be damaging to them, again, on diplomatic grounds, on military grounds, a whole host of things. Russia's winning the conflict on the ground, and ultimately this conflict will be decided on the ground. They consider the Black Sea a sideshow. They don't want to risk their navy any further to be damaged and taken out by unmanned surface. And what do they hit back? Because the Kiev regime doesn't have a navy. So it's kind of lopsided. It's just the realities of modern drone warfare that, in a tight, lined by coasts bodies of the Black Sea, rather than big blue water space, it's a whole new type of naval warfare happening here. And it's not worth the risks of putting their navy at risk to fight a war that they can. What do they hit back? It's nothing but shadows and drones on the other side. It's kind of,
it's not equal in that sense.
If you want to consider that a Kiev regime victory, sure. I mean, you can if you want to call it that. It's not going to decide the conflict, and Russia will attempt to sideline this whole thing and kind of just hope it goes away.
Last question before I let you go. We have about 4 minutes. Venezuela. Um, One of the Russian leaders, God, I can't think of his name. He said this almost like a month ago, and I need to find the
Yeah.
quote. But he pointed out, he says, "Look, we need to stand by our allies," and he was somewhat aggressive on this idea that Russia should assist Venezuela. Do you see that happening, or not so much?
No.
I mean, there's an argument that's being made that part of the reason that they're going after Venezuela is to go after Cuba. And there's a
Sure.
question of whether or not Russia would also stand by Cuba in the situation, or whether they would just let both fall by the
Okay.
wayside.
So, I mean, obviously, there's going to be greater pressure if after Venezuela it comes to Cuba. But for right now, Russia and China aren't going to do much. No matter how much people want to scream in the comments that Russia and China have the ability to stop the U.S. on the other side of the Western Hemisphere from overthrowing a militarily weak, government sitting on top of the world's largest proven energy reserves. They don't. They don't have the ability to arm them. Now, they could go to a brink of nuclear confrontation by putting missiles or Oreshniks there that they would have to fire because the Venezuelans couldn't fire them. And then we'd be back in a Cuban Missile Crisis scenario on top of everything else. But Russia is not willing to go there at this point, not for Venezuela. They don't like what's going on. They may provide some degree of assistance, but ultimately, whatever they and the Chinese can provide will be much smaller than people would hope it would be, in the alt media fandom. And it will only be about raising costs to the U.S. That's all they can effectively do. Ultimately, the U.S. will attempt to win this, not with a military invasion, but with the CIA and supporting the opposition in Venezuela. They will attempt to co-opt and bribe and blackmail the Venezuelan military and political leadership, as they did in Syria, right? As they did in Iraq and Libya, as they tried to do with only limited success in Iran. But ultimately, I found this statistic: the maximum pay of a Venezuelan soldier is $100 a month, which is 1/5 of what is considered for the minimum living standard. 1/5 of what a family of four needs in Venezuela. So that is the Syrian scenario all over again. And no matter how much people want to believe that the Venezuelan military will stand by the socialist principles, the Bolivarian revolution, I'm a cynic, and I might wish, and that it might be otherwise. But CIA is very good at this type of thing.
Yeah.
So all that's left then is those who would resist, and some type of guerrilla, conflict, some type of unconventional conflict to raise the costs to make Venezuela ungovernable. That's really, of course, what Trump would be concerned about, energy costs rising and that sort of thing. But I don't know. That's very hard to predict, how that would turn around. But can the U.S. regime change Maduro, right, with decapitation strikes and this type of CIA operation? Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much guaranteed. Now, the word out from CNN in the last few hours was that in the Trump-Maduro phone call that did not go well, according to Western mainstream media, Maduro offered to step down in 18 months. Which
Trump said no.
Trump said no, you go now.
Trump said no, yeah.
Yeah, so I would not, if at the end of the day, Maduro is placed with putting his country through an invasion and possible civil war, or stepping down himself and cutting some type of deal with the U.S., it is not completely unbelievable that at some point, not to put his own country through that he would agree to. He might. Especially if he was able to pick his successor, right? Because a large part of it is going to be about, is going to be about perception, right? Donald Trump needs a win. He needs a victory. He needs Maduro to go. That is the most important thing to him. The oil and everything else is a nice icing on the cake, but maybe that can be massaged afterward. So, but
Mark Sleboda.
Yeah, not a good situation for Venezuela.
No, that is it's just outrageous.
Ultimately, there's someone sitting in Langley saying, "Oh, you try to take our Kiev regime proxy from us. Oh, we're going to take Syria and Nepal and Venezuela off your side of the board." I'm sure of that.
Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Boosty under Real Politic with Mark Sleboda, or if you just put in his name, Mark Sleboda, both of those things will bring him up on Boosty. All of his interviews and everything else are there. Mark, you're fantastic. Great breakdown. The Venezuela thing is disturbing, to put it mildly. You have a fantastic day, man. Thank you for this. Be safe.
You as well. Cheers.
Bye-bye. All right. And I see my next guest is here. Fantastic breakdown by Mark. As always, the Venezuela thing is disturbing, to put it mildly. Just raw force and threats. And we will see if Maduro ultimately accepts those threats and steps down, or whether or not Maduro is willing to defend his country. Yeah, that's a rough one. Let me bring in my guests. David, how you doing, man? You doing okay today?
Not bad, you?
I am doing fine. I'm doing fine. Better that you're joining me. We're joined with David Hundeyin. He is an investigative journalist, author, and filmmaker, founder of West Africa Weekly, and a 2023 James Curry Fellow at Cambridge University. David, you also, what is the name of your online program for the audience, just so they can tune in and they can be aware of it?
I don't have an online program. If you're referring to the news platform that I started recently, it's called The Spearhead.
Spearhead. Okay.
Yeah.
For some reason, I thought there was an online program. Okay. Okay. So explain what that is, because maybe my understanding of it is wrong.
So it's essentially a news and current affairs platform, which is set up to occupy the space that was vacated by African Stream when it got struck down by the US State Department. So that's like my goal, to occupy that space, which is to tell the story of the world, but from an African point of view, from an African perspective, from a Pan-Africanist perspective. That's what we're doing.
Okay. I will add that to your bio just so I would have it. And thank you for that. I remember when Africa Weekly was struck down, and this was around the same time that they got rid of our radio station. Yeah. It was like all of the stuff was taking place back to back, and it was outrageous. It's a very heady and bizarre thing for a governmental body to go after you directly. That is very strange.
Yes.
It's very nebulous.
Yes,
it feels very sinister.
Nothing can prepare you for that. Yes.
Yeah, that's very strange. That's very weird. But I'm glad that you were able to, as you point out, occupy the space that was. I mean, obviously, you were doing something right if the U.S. government decided that they needed to go after you directly.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
One of the
here we are.
Yeah, I mean, it's oddly enough, it's a badge of honor in a weird space. I know it's not the most comfortable thing in the world, but it's oddly enough a badge of honor. Like the U.S. government could go after a million different things, and it decided that Africa Weekly was the thing that it needed to focus its attention. Africa Stream, I'm sorry, was the thing it needed to focus its attention on in order to remove. That's it's a badge of honor, even though it's kind of a backwards one. One of the things I wanted to hit. So there was, I think it's called Guinea-Bissau. The president apparently fled after what they call a post-election coup. And Maduro, I think is Cisco Embalo, he was released. Apparently, ECOWAS, I guess, found a way to get him released and get him out of the country. Yeah. And apparently the military effectively took over once again. Is this another quote-unquote junta taking over in the vein of the Sahel states, or is this something different?
This absolutely is not. This is more in the vein of Gabon or maybe
Ah,
Guinea.
okay.
So it's what you call an establishment coup, where the establishment carries out an action that resembles a coup, but the real purpose of that action is to preserve and maintain the status quo. So in the case of Gabon, when this was done in 2023, that happened at the time when there was a series of nationalist coups taking place across the Sahel region and
Hmm.
you know West West Africa, which France considers to be its domain of influence in Africa. So, as I'm sure you may know, the three countries which remain under French influence and which France considers to be absolutely essential to its existence as an empire in Africa are Gabon, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire. Now, the three coups that are taking place in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso had sort of gone right across that belt. And the then president of Gabon, a guy called Ali Bongo, he had suffered a stroke recently, and he wasn't up to the task of basically maintaining the status quo any longer. So the fear was that some military officers in Gabon might be getting ideas from what was happening in Sahel, and there might be a nationalist coup that would happen. So to preempt that, the president's cousin, Bryce Nguema, who was himself a high-ranking military officer, then carried out that coup. And basically, it was a coup where there was no bloodshed, nobody was hurt. The president's family was held for a while, and then earlier this year, they were quietly released. So there's actually a video which actually we put out on the Spearhead. It was a video that was secretly filmed by Ali Bongo's eldest son, Nuruddin Bongo, where after he was released, I think he was using a spyglass camera to record the video. And it was a
Uh,
meeting he had with Bryce Nguema, who has since transitioned from being the transitional president to being a civilian elected president, right? He took off his military uniform, he held sham elections, and he declared himself democratically elected. So he was having a meeting with Nuruddin Bongo, that's the oldest son of Ali Bongo, whom he deposed. And he was basically saying in this video, which is now available online, that, this is just a family affair. We had to do this because if we didn't do this and somebody else did it, it would have been catastrophic. But as you can see, we've treated you well. We didn't put you in prison. And as I've been telling Macron, that's the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, we've treated you
mhm.
well. There hasn't been any problem. So now that we're releasing you, don't try to take any vengeance. Don't cause any rancor. Just basically disappear into the night quietly. Right. So that's the coup that took place in Gabon, and that's pretty much what has taken place in Guinea-Bissau now. So the president who lost the election, it's well known that he lost the election. The establishment around him then carried out this coup, and in the process of carrying out the coup, also arrested the actual presumed winner of the election and put him
Mhm.
in detention where he still remains. Now, the president who was supposedly deposed in this coup was then released by these coup plotters. So he first went to Senegal. Now he's in the Republic of Congo under the protection of Denis Sassou Nguesso, whom I'm sure it will not surprise you to know is yet another long surviving French puppet in Africa. He's been in power, I believe, for 39 years now. If I recall correctly, might be more. So that's what has happened. It's the establishment protecting itself using the optics of a coup, but it's not a coup in the conventional sense. Definitely nothing nationalistic about it. The entire purpose is basically just to maintain the status quo.
I see. Okay. So this is not the same thing. This is basic. Okay. Maintain the
Absolutely
status
not.
quo. Wow. All right. Fair enough. Because I saw this and I was like, okay, what is this? Is this something very similar to what was taking place in the other states? Not so much. So France is maintaining a certain degree of control over, let's say, several of these states. Um,
Mm.
Guinea-Bissau being one of those states. Am I getting this wrong, or am I
Well,
understanding it
so
correctly?
Guinea-Bissau is actually it's actually a former Portuguese colony.
Okay.
So they are technically Lusophone. However, you're also not wrong in the sense that France has an outsized influence across the entire West African region. So basically in West Africa, with the exception of Nigeria, Ghana, and maybe Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire, Sierra Leone and Liberia, which are Anglophone, the rest of the
Mhm.
region is presumed Francophone. So even the parts of West Africa which are not technically Francophone, like Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, which are supposedly Lusophone, they're kind of surrounded by Francophone countries, and they're kind of unofficially part of the Francophone project and unofficially still under some form of French influence and French domination. And even if they are not central to the France Afrique project, just the fact that if another nationalist coup were to take place in the region, amongst other things, what it would do, even if it doesn't directly affect the position of France, because maybe France is not directly invested in those countries, what it would do is that it would reduce the power of ECOWAS. So ECOWAS is the regional body, the Economic Community of West African States. If you recall, the AES, the three countries of the Sahelian Alliance, have actually backed out of
Pulled out of
ECOWAS. So
ECOWAS.
it used to be,
Right.
yeah, it used to be 15 member states. It's now 12. ECOWAS, as I'm also sure you know, is basically, for lack of a better term, it's an appendage of French foreign policy. It's been basically
Yes.
captured almost entirely by France. So if the influence of ECOWAS is waning in the sense that more and more member states are leaving. So actually, it's no longer 12 member states, it's 11. So it started with 15, then Mauritania was the first to leave, then Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. So it's 11 now. If Guinea-Bissau were to fall, quote unquote, to the to the same nationalist movements that is sweeping across the Sahel, then that would mean that there will be 10 member states left in ECOWAS from 15
S-
and counting. And what that would inevitably mean is that from different directions, France is losing its ability to exert influence in West Africa. That's why, as tiny a country as Guinea-Bissau is, that's why this was a big deal.
mm, okay. So there was a real concern that there would be an overthrow if
Yes.
this election went through. Wow. Okay. So this feeling is spreading. I mean, throughout Africa. Meaning, this seems to be a pretty aggressive move in order to prevent what
Yes.
some consider to be an actual overthrow, which means that
Yes.
the overthrow was a potential in this particular case. So this is not something that is being isolated to Sahel states. This is something that seems to be spreading throughout, at the very least, various parts of Africa.
Yes, absolutely. So I
You,
mean, and I believe I've said this before that the this is not a Sahelian issue and it's not a West African issue, it's an African issue. Even the parts of Africa which maybe have not historically been as unstable as the Sahel, maybe they don't have the security problems that the Sahel has had. The
mhm,
message is starting to get through because I think the access to information that has been provided by widespread, cheap, high-speed internet access now has made it such that a lot of people across the continent, especially the younger segments of the population, are now getting a sort of greater understanding of their position in the global political economy, if that makes sense. And they're realizing that, as against what they were told, that the reasons behind Africa's poverty were just basically corruption, and poor governments and inability to hold your government accountable, all those buzzwords. There's actually something much, much, much bigger and much uglier going on. And this is not necessarily a local thing. You're starting to understand that as long as the current system persists, the current so-called electoral democracy, which most of the continent, pretends to adhere to, which essentially is just an extension of Western influence on the continent, as long as that system persists, that you're never going to not be poor, because the current global economy requires Africa to be poor. It requires Africa to restrict itself to
mhm.
extraction of cheap raw materials and natural resources. And there is a wider understanding of that what these people in the Sahel are fighting for is not just an end to being dominated by France. They're actually fighting for the right to achieve self-actualization. They're fighting for the right to
Sovereignty.
beneficiate their own natural resources, to move up the value chain, to make real money, to access real value in the global economy, to have better lives, and to have the ability to provide better lives for their people. And that is actually where the crux of the matter is. That's, if you like, junction point that determines whether people get to have good lives or not. That's actually where it's located. It's an issue of national sovereignty primarily, not an issue about democracy or corruption or any of those like Western NGO buzzwords. It's actually
Yeah.
an issue of basic sovereignty versus colonialism, right?
What
So that awareness is growing across the continent. And I personally think that the Rubicon has been crossed and it can't be crossed back. So here we are.
you wrote you were in the back and forth on your Twitter thing, and you wrote it was rather long, but there's a part of it that I want to go into. You said that's why
Mm.
one man, one vote, electoral democracy or Western control parody of it that we practice in Africa is a terrible idea. We need firm authoritarian nationalists who understand the number two enemy of African economic and political freedom is self-destructive, externally controlled mind of colonized African humans. Dig into that. Now, the reason I'm actually digging into that because a Western audience who has this kind of emancipatory idea of democracy as the
Mhm.
greatest thing ever will recoil at this idea that one man, one vote
Of course.
is a problem. Why is one man, one vote a problem? Explain that.
Well, so the first thing that the Western audience will need to understand is that an electoral democracy in the West and an electoral democracy in Africa are two completely different things. So, an electoral democracy in the West, putting aside the fact that obviously their interests that control capital, who ultimately make the decisions and are behind the scenes controlling everything, just taking it at face value, you would imagine that an election in the West is an event where the people get to choose their own leaders, and that's the be all and end all. To a certain extent, that's how it is. We know it's not quite that simple. We know that there are ways of rigging elections in the West beyond obviously the visible stuff.
Uh-huh.
But an election in Africa or an electoral democracy in Africa is a completely different thing to anything in the West. The first thing you need to understand about electoral democracies in Africa is that the actual mechanics of holding an election, the institutions, the processes involved in electoral democracy are not controlled by Africans. And this is not just a thing that people say. This is something I have seen firsthand, right? Because this is an experience I have lived. I come from Nigeria, right? So when there's an election holding in Nigeria, you find out first of all there's this thing called a foreign election observer who is
Mhm.
completely ubiquitous across the whole process. Now, you're in America. I'm sure you've never seen someone from Cote d'Ivoire come to the US to observe your elections and make sure that they're
No,
credible.
no,
No, because
no.
an election in the West is understood to be a sovereign national event. In Africa, your so-called election is being overseen by white people. That's literally how it works, right? So the actual process itself, you are not in control of it, right? So there's a whole network of interests, of foreign governments and embassies and NGOs who actually have more power in the supposed electoral democracy than any voter does. That's the reality. Um, the Now, assuming you can get past that layer of interference and assuming somehow you can get credible options on the ballots and hope that somehow that will lead you to Nirvana, what then happens? You realize that um, what actually swings people's decisions on voting day can be something as little as who is able to buy them a plate of rice, who's able to buy them a t-shirt,
What?
because that's actually how poor people are, right? When you see those statistics talking about people living on less than $1 a day, and it sounds all, you know, sounds like it's unimaginable. It's a reality in many parts of the continent. People really are that poor, right? And again, this is something that I have seen personally. So in such a system where people literally line up voters on election day and give them cash bribes. So it could be as little as 1,500 naira, which is roughly just over $1. That's about $1.10. and people will literally sell their votes for $1.10. So is that a democracy? Because people got to cast their ballots. My argument is that's not a democracy at all. My argument is that the person who controls capital in that system is the dictator, is the hidden authoritarian, because that's the person who will always get his way because he has the money and the people don't. And the people are so poor that they can be bought and they are bought. So in that situation, trying to get those people who themselves are slaves to their own, to the infrastructure of their own enslavement, and who cannot seem to you know endure the what's the word I'm looking for, the inconvenience that it will take to break out of that system and to resist the vote buying and whatnot. In that kind of situation, what is the only realistic way of attaining some measure of sovereignty? The only realistic way is that someone or some group of people need to take control of that civic space, probably using violence, using force, and ensure that all these bad actors, be they the local controllers of capital, be they the foreign entities that have an interest in, swinging the election either way based on their geopolitical interests, that these people do not have access to the levers of political control. And that's what you would then call a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime, or any of those buzzwords that we use. But the point is, those things are um, they're entities of necessity, right?
Mhm.
Nobody came to this world in Africa thinking, wow, wouldn't it be great if my head of state were a military officer who carries
Right.
a gun around? Nobody thinks that. Nobody really wants that. I don't, fundamentally. But the reality is, Africa is in such a situation. And the only group of people who have the ability to ensure that an African country maintains some form, some semblance of sovereignty are those who happen to control the levels of violence, state violence. That's the only way it can work. Electoral democracy on the weak continent that currently exists is basically just an open door for any interest to come in and do absolutely whatever the hell they want to do. And that's why these Western interests cannot shut up about why democracy is so important for Africa, because from their point of view, it's amazing, it's excellent. It gives them the things that they had to fight wars over, a century or two ago, right? If they wanted to go into a part of Africa to exploit it, to steal resources or whatever, they had to fight actual literal wars. Once upon a time, wars that spanned decades. They lost people, right? There's a part of Nigeria, southern Nigeria, which famously has a very famous name, White Man's Graveyard. And the reason it has that name is that it took them decades to actually militarily subdue this area. And this place was notorious for being a place where they just could not win. And every time they tried to win, they would get slaughtered en masse. And it's actually a historical, you can actually Google it. There's actually I think it's like a heritage site in Nigeria or something, the White Man's
Mhm.
Graveyard. That's what parts of Africa used to be once upon a time, because it was that difficult to penetrate to get what you wanted from there. But now, with this democratic scheme that exists, you don't even need to put in any effort whatsoever. All you need to do is just send in an election observer and some NGO director. Those people wield more power with their iPads and their pens. They wield more power than the government of the country that they're going to do whatever it is that they're going to do it in, right? And that's because the infrastructure around this thing called democracy that has been set up in Africa is something that most people in the West have no idea about. They've never seen it before. They don't. So when people in the West say use the word democracy, what they're thinking of, they're thinking of some Second Amendment, some House of Parliament, some House of Senate, House of Representatives,
Right.
separation of powers. I know my rights. Don't tread on me. Yada yada yada. That's a world away from what it means in Africa. Is a completely different thing on this continent. So, which is why I have no apologies for saying that one man, one vote electoral democratic system, which is being promoted in Africa, is a terrible idea, and it's being promoted in very, very, very bad faith by colonial entities for the worst possible reasons. And the only realistic alternative to that system now, being that this is a system that is so, powerful and all encompassing, the only real alternative to it is the alternative of people who have the capacity to use the levers of state violence to enforce national sovereignty. And right now,
Mhm.
that happens to only be the military. Maybe if there were another option someday, I'll be willing to explore that too. But right now, we're in a situation where you have a choice between survival and approval. Now, the democracy comes with the approval, but you're going to die in the process, and your children are going to die poor, and their children will die poor, and their children too. But you'll be approved, or you can survive and make your way in the world like China did. But then they're going to call you authoritarian, dictatorship, blah blah blah, communist, all the buzzwords that they throw out there. But at the end of the day, I really couldn't care less about those things because at this
Right.
point, what I do care about is that when so I'm 35 now. If I'm fortunate enough to have another 35 years on this planet before I leave, I want to know when I'm leaving that the Africa that I met when I came into the world in 1990 is not the same Africa that my children are going to live in, right? It's not the poverty that I became visually accustomed with and I thought of as normal before I left Africa and traveled the world and I realized just how poor we really were. I don't want that to be my kids' normal. So
Yeah.
for me, that poor people um, have no business taking part in certain conversations, right? If you're poor, you cannot be free. If you're poor, by default, you are enslaved. By default, you are enslaved to whoever controls capital. So, on a continental sense, Africa being poor means that it's enslaved to who controls capital, which is Europe and North America. It's the Western Atlantic Empire, if you like. That's just the material reality. So, the only job, the only assignment that Africa has, and that's just not with regard to political system. That's also with regard to things like energy systems. Africa has no business taking part in this so-called energy transition. Right, the only job Africa has is to get itself out of poverty by any and every means possible. When you are no longer a $1,000 per capita GDP society, right? When you're at $10,000 and above, when you are in proper middle to high income territory, when you have a real voice in the world, when you have military capacity that makes it impossible for someone to stage an invasion of your country, when you have real sovereignty in that respect, then you can have certain conversations, right? And then you can have all the talk about whether you want a certain type of democracy or you want this or you want that. But until then, your job is to survive. And right now, we're not surviving. Right now, we're being decimated. So the survival comes first. And I make no apologies for that whatsoever.
No, you explain it extraordinarily well. Democracy is a fig leaf. It's a tool of control. Um, it's not a show of sovereignty. It's the opposite of that. Do you see movement in that direction of this notion of economic security, or you don't see a movement towards that?
It's happening in the Sahel. I wish it was happening across the whole of
Other parts
Africa,
of Africa?
or at least at
Yeah.
that speed. That's not the case, but it's definitely happening in Sahel, which is why I see a lot of hope coming from that place because they get it. Like, they genuinely get it. They're not just content with being sort of sloganizing, aesthetic revolutionaries. They're actually fundamentally trying to transform the reality of their people. And even though those are localized projects, even though Burkina Faso, as I've said earlier, is not a very big country, um, Mali has limited influence in the world, or Niger. But what it will do is that inevitably over the next 5 to 10 years, when living standards become like unignorable in those countries relative to their neighbors, when it becomes visible to the blind and audible to the deaf, that these guys
Mhm.
have done something right and they have done something unprecedented, what that will do is that it will create this incredible wave of political pressure in other African countries because if you've been looking at these three countries have been at or around the poorest in the world for decades, right? For decades, the annual GDP rankings had Niger and Burkina Faso constantly swapping places in the bottom two, constantly swapping places. This year is Niger, next year is Burkina Faso at the bottom. And then all of a sudden, 2022, Burkina Faso has a revolution. The following year, Niger has a revolution. And next thing you know, between 2022 and 2025, Burkina Faso's economy has expanded cumulatively 43% in 3 years. So, which means in another 3 to 4 years, the economy of Burkina Faso would have effectively doubled since 2022. I doubt whether Burkina Faso, like, how many decades did it take Burkina Faso's economy to double from independence in 1960?
Yeah.
And it's going to do that in less than a decade. So again, the results are going to speak for themselves, and the rest of Africa is going to be unable to ignore it. And then the political pressure at home, across, especially among their neighbors, is going to become completely unignorable. Um, I'm pretty sure that there are a few people in the region, a few, Western aligned heads of state in the region who are very worried. People like Alassane Ouattara, I'll be very worried if I were him too, because I think he'll be among the first to be swept away by that wave when it happens, because
Well,
he has affixed himself as the spearhead of French colonialism in West Africa. Everything bad that France wants to do in West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire is a staging point, right? He's, I mean, I don't think I need to explain the role that he personally plays in West Africa. He's what he is, right? He's a puppet. But
mhm,
when that wave of pressure begins, and Burkina Faso, which for decades has been Cote d'Ivoire's poor cousin for the longest time, and then when Burkinabe start having a standard of living that is equivalent to or greater than that of Ivorians, there's going to be an almighty wave of questions to answer, which he's not going to be able to answer. And there's going to be a real problem, not just for him, but for France. Because once he goes, and once the French puppeteering of Cote d'Ivoire goes, then the only sort of bulkheads that France has left in all of West and Central Africa are basically Senegal and Gabon. Now, Senegal, it's already not on. It's not on the strong footing in Senegal that it once was on. Already, it's had to evacuate its military from Senegal. So I believe by the end of this year, I think is when the full evacuation should have been completed. So there's no longer direct French military deployment on Senegal shores. I believe there's still some French military deployments in Gabon and in Cameroon, but those are very, very small, relatively localized projects. So basically, the only tool that France will have left in the region will be the CFA franc, which will be the easiest thing to get rid of once there's no longer the French military on the ground to actually enforce it.
mhm.
So it's going to be a problem for a lot of people. So the next 3 to 5 years will be very, very interesting. And I, for one, am absolutely loving it.
No, yeah. Wow. France is being kicked out of Africa in real terms for all intents
Yeah.
and purposes. What role does ECOWAS have in this? I mean, they're calling themselves an economic organization, but obviously, if you're pointing out that they are not attending to the needs or the economic needs of Africans, then this is also some kind of organization that is being used as a tool for external influence and control.
So the problem with ECOWAS is a similar problem with the African Union, and is that the bulk of its budget isn't coming from its member states; it's coming from Europe. Right. So the European Union and France specifically play a very outsized role in funding ECOWAS. So, as I recall correctly, initially the majority funder of ECOWAS was Nigeria, when Nigeria used to
Mhm.
be Nigeria. Um, but over the past couple of decades, there's been a significant, well, let me not say, let's say over the past 35 years, ever since the US State Department explicitly identified Nigeria as a threat to its designs for Africa, um, the capacity of the Nigerian state has been severely eroded. Which is not to say that Nigeria is some innocent victim in all of this, because Nigeria, I think it's fair to say, Um, there's always been a large number of willing tools in Nigeria, and there still are. Um, but yeah, the capacity of the Nigerian state to project itself and to serve as a shield for West Africa, as it once did, has been severely eroded. I mean, once upon a time, as recently as the late 90s, Nigeria was a country that was able to deploy its military to quell civil wars in neighboring countries, as it did in Liberia and in Sierra Leone. It cannot do that anymore. It simply doesn't have the capacity even to quell disturbances on its own territory. So, with along with that loss of capacity has also come loss of its influence in ECOWAS. It used to be the primary funder of ECOWAS. A lot of the ECOWAS institutions, including the ECOWAS Secretariat itself, are physically located in Nigeria, but a lot of the funding now comes from Europe and specifically from France and Germany. So that's the problem. So that institution is no longer a West African focused Pan Africanist institution, which is what it was designed as. That's what it was meant to be. It's no longer that. It's now turning into this fragmented, I'll give you an example of just how ineffective ECOWAS is becoming. So one of the primary reasons for existence of ECOWAS is that there must be free movement within West Africa. On paper,
Right.
there is free movement. On paper, if you have like a Ghanaian passport, you can move anywhere in the ECOWAS region without the need for a visa or anything like that. On paper, that's how it is. In practice, if you're moving, if you're moving between Anglophone and Francophone ECOWAS member states, they can give you a problem. So if you have a Nigerian passport, for example, and you're traveling to Cote d'Ivoire or to Togo, they can give you a whole lot of problems. It's supposed to be the customs union, free trade area, free movement area. It's supposed to be that, but in practice, it's not. In practice, if you're conducting cross-border business, you're trying to say move goods from Ghana to Nigeria, the Nigerian customs are going to ask you to pay duties for goods that came from a fellow ECOWAS member state, which goes against the ECOWAS charter, but it's a thing that happens. So
Uh,
the institution itself has become something that exists more like notionally than practically, as with many other things African. So this is what Ibrahim Traore meant when he said that ECOWAS is no longer useful to the aspirations of those who want a free Africa, and that they have to create their own institutions, which is why they
yes.
went and created the AES. And I think it was very telling when they created the AES. They didn't then create that and then sort of try to wall everybody out of it. They created the AES and then said that any ECOWAS passport holder still has visa-free access to AES. So on the one hand, they're saying that this institution is no longer useful, it's no longer in line with the aspirations of those who created it. However,
Yeah.
the constituent members of this institution are still very much our West African brothers, and you are still welcome. We still want to do business with you. We still want you to be able to come in and move out freely. So, eventually, I mean, okay, let me not say I think, let's say I hope that
AES
eventually,
replaces ECOWAS.
yes, exactly, that um, especially if there are more of these popular revolutions that in the West African region, that the new governments will take what I think is the obvious decision and simply join the Silent Alliance. In my sort of feverish wet dreams, I dream of a time when something like that will happen in Nigeria, and I'll wake up one day and hear an announcement that Nigeria has joined the AES. Because if that were to happen, I think it's fair to say that like that project would have hit maximum velocity at that point. It would have hit breakout velocity at that point, and it'd be impossible to stop. But wishes aren't horses. This is just me, throwing thoughts into the void. But
Yeah.
fingers crossed.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I see why you come to that assessment. Honestly, I do. I mean, like I said, from people in the West, they raise democracy as the highest thing in the world, and they kind of miss the point that this is Martin Luther King thing too, right? Where people forget that he was a socialist, and his argument was effectively, if you don't have economic freedom, you don't have freedom. Like, what's the point of being free to
Exactly.
die with cancer on the sidewalk, right? It's like, yeah, you don't have a house, you don't have healthcare, you don't have education, you don't have any of this stuff, but you're free.
Yeah.
It's like, dude, that's
I
not
was
a
I
freedom.
was I was making this exact point recently on I believe it was on Twitter where I said um a Nigerian will speak to a Chinese person and the Nigerian will tell the Chinese person, I have more freedom than you. Isn't that absolutely ridiculous?
Yes.
Because the Nigerian would say, I can vote for my president, but you can't. Therefore, I have more freedom than you. Meanwhile, the Chinese person would look at the Nigerian person and think, the clothes you're wearing are made somewhere in the in
China.
I forget what region of China it is, somewhere in southern
Yeah.
China. The phone you're holding is made in Shenzhen. The mobile network that the phone operates on is built on Huawei and ZTE equipment, which are made in Shenzhen, and those are Chinese companies. The car that you're driving in is probably built in
Yeah.
China.
Yeah.
The railways and the trains in your country were probably built by the China Civil Engineering and Construction Company or the China Railway Construction Company. The the roads, the docks, the infrastructure, everything that you enjoy in your country was probably built by China. Everything that gives you the ability to stand up and even talk to me like this was probably Chinese. So what on earth do you mean by you have more freedom? What is freedom? And this is it's a very I personally think this is like some sort of neo-colonial psychological operation that has been activated on Africans because why would the definition of freedom in the popular African imagination be something that is relating to some quotes from George Washington or Benjamin Franklin or something? I literally heard someone who is like born and raised in Nigeria, never left West Africa before, quoting Benjamin Franklin that he who is willing to trade freedom for security deserves neither. And I'm thinking, well, Benjamin
Right.
Franklin
Right.
he owned African slaves when he made that comment.
Yeah.
Yeah, that quote was not for you. It has nothing
Yeah.
to do with you. He lives in a completely different reality to you. Why are you inserting yourself into that reality? And I think, well, I don't think, I know that there's been a very, very successful messaging program to convince Africans that they live in a reality that they don't live in. So their definition of freedom should include references to Benjamin Franklin, their their idea of what it means to be politically free for some reason should not include freedom to be able to feed your kids, should not include freedom to be able to get treated in the hospital and not go bankrupt while you're at it, or to even have the facilities to even treat whatever ailment that you're suffering from. Somehow all of those freedoms don't constitute freedom. The only thing that constitutes freedom is this narrow band of Western designated issues that constitute freedom. So freedom means freedom of the press, or what they call freedom of the press, because they definitely don't have a free press, or what they call freedom of the press, freedom of religion and worship, supposedly, freedom of speech, supposedly, what they call freedom of speech, um, freedom of civil society. This very narrow band of things that somehow have been designated as the ultimate freedoms that are worth everything and everything. But somehow, freedom to have food in your stomach, freedom to have
Economic.
a house to live in, those things are not considered freedoms. Among the
Yeah.
world's poorest
Economic
people, who
liberation.
who decided that?
Yeah. Economic liberation is the pathway to freedom, from my point of view. It has to be. Otherwise, what's the point? Right. David, man, I've enjoyed this conversation. I always enjoy these conversations with you. You always give food for thought and and this kind of explanation that we may not necessarily get from the side of the world. Thank you for this. David Hundeyin, he's an investigative journalist, author, filmmaker, founder of West Africa Weekly, 2023 James Curry Fellow at Cambridge University. He also runs Spearhead. It is a news channel, news and a current affairs platform for African topics, African issues. David, thank you for this, man. You be safe, okay?
All right, thank you for having me.
Have a good one. Bye-bye. All right. Shout out to David. He always gives a good breakdown. My man, Caleb Maupin. How you doing, Caleb? You doing okay today?
I'm great. How about yourself?
I am doing well. I think I'm dragging a little bit of ass, but I'm doing okay otherwise. Caleb Maupin. He is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, author, director of CPI, Center for Political Innovation, an active organization that goes out pushing political issues, trying to bring sides together, something that is a worthy cause. Caleb, it was funny. I think you were on the show, I think it was maybe time before last, and you were talking about, I believe you were talking about, what is his name? I can't believe his name dropped out of my mind. The one that recently got shot, that they were using all of this political hay over.
Charlie Kirk.
Charlie Kirk. And there was somebody in the chat who was like, does anybody else feel bad about trashing Kirk after the conversation with Caleb? You were trying to make this point of saying, look, like the things that bring us together, or the things that we all care about, breach political divides. And oftentimes, there's a lot of stuff that's seeded into our media in order to drive people apart and to resist those urges of being pulled apart in those ways. No, it's a worthy objective. It's a worthy cause. I brought you on. I wanted to talk about Venezuela because I don't think we are looking at a bluff. It seems like we're looking at something that is more than a bluff at this point. The New York Times, I believe it was also the Wall Street Journal, pointed out that there was a secret, potentially secret, and Maduro said this wasn't true, but a secret conversation between Maduro and Donald Trump. Maduro said, I'd leave in 18 months. Donald Trump said, that's unacceptable. You need to leave immediately, or else effectively we're going to murder a lot of Venezuelans. Give me your take on this. Just let's, a summation, and we can step into it after the summation. This is obviously grotesque and over the top. And like, this is a Monroe Doctrine in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time.
I mean, this looks to me like an administration that is completely incompetent and doesn't know what it's doing. Because, I mean, they have been building up and building up. And generally in warfare, you want the element of surprise. You don't want your enemy to be prepared. And
Right.
they have been building up and building up and threatening and threatening and threatening. And that led many people to the conclusion that maybe they won't do anything because they've just built up and built up and built up, but they haven't done anything. And it seems to me that there are people in the administration who don't want to strike Venezuela, and there are people in the administration who really do. And it looks like those forces that really do haven't given up. And, you know, I mean, I've heard the reports, same reports that you've heard. They say strikes are going to happen later this week. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's awful. It's an awful situation. I mean, I'm horrified by the whole thing. What I find to be amusing about the whole thing is that Venezuela is far less isolated than they would be if there was a Democrat in the White House. There's widespread support for them in Colombia and, you know, South America. Europe even is opposing the strikes on Venezuela. So the United States is going to be isolated if it goes ahead and strikes Venezuela. It's going to be completely isolated. There's going to be widespread sympathy and support for Venezuela. I mean, the whole situation is going to further isolate the United States. It's going to make Venezuela much more loved internationally. And I think on some level, Trump is trying to perform. He's trying to, you know, get points with the neocon crowd that is angry with him about the Ukraine war ending and, you know, the negotiations with Ukraine. And he's saying, well, okay, fine. But look what I'm doing in Venezuela. Look, I'm trying to do something here. And I mean, it's all just a big mess. It's absolutely a disaster. And I look at the situation. Maduro is not isolated. He's walking the streets of Caracas. He's got widespread support, right? He's ready to fight. He's not isolated at all. I mean, the United States is going to hurt its international image by doing this. I feel like Trump is under the impression that attacking Venezuela or getting Maduro to leave or something like that is going to win him points with somebody. And it's like, it's going to win him points with a very, very narrow constituency of like Pentagon war hawks. It's not going to really win him points with the U.S. public. It's not going to win him points internationally. The whole situation is very, very unfortunate. I'm very opposed. And that's CPI. We've been out in the streets. Our members were in Venice Beach. They were out, hitting the streets of Venice Beach with, hands off Venezuela. We disrupted the No Kings rallies to say hands off Venezuela. We are with Venezuela 100%. I mean, this is absolutely unconscionable. This shouldn't be happening. The USA should not strike Venezuela. And I hope that there's still a chance they won't, right? I hope that cooler heads will prevail and de-escalation will take place. And I understand that there's Wagner military people there, right? Military contractors from Russia. I understand they've got a lot of Chinese tanks. They've got a lot of Chinese airplanes. They're ready to fight back. And I'm seeing reports that Venezuela could retaliate in ways that could actually hurt the United States. That's kind of being underestimated. People expect that Venezuela will just take it, right? They'll get a hit and then it'll be bad and they'll just take it. But I'm seeing reports that they could actually retaliate in ways that could really seriously harm the United States. Now, if there's actually some kind of ground invasion of Venezuela, we're looking at an all-out war that's going to be disastrous. But whether or not there's strikes or whether or not this is just a giant bluff still has to be seen. I think the White House doesn't know what it wants to do and is very confused, and that Trump wants to look good more than anything. I think that's Trump's primary concern, is how can he look good here? And he's kind of in a situation where he can't look good. I mean, there's really no way out of this for him to look good. And it's similar to the Ukraine situation. No matter how he responds, no matter what he does, he's going to look bad. Now, with Ukraine, Trump has the out now of the corruption investigation, right? Ukraine has been stealing and pilfering our taxpayer money. So if they try to say poor Ukraine, he can say, look, they were stealing our money, right? And his base, America First, taxpayer money, we're being robbed, Department of Government Efficiency. Trump has kind of an out with Ukraine, which is the corruption scandal. He can use that to cover himself. When they make him look like the most heartless, poor guy, heartless guy who just doesn't care for those poor Ukrainians, he can say, look, they were stealing our money. They stole billions of dollars worth of our tax money. They were robbing us. There was a scam going on. Sam Bankman-Fried. What else do you want to, so that gives Trump an out there with Ukraine. Plus, he can emphasize jobs, right? Now, Kirill Dmitriev was given the Chamber of Commerce Award in Russia. They had the Thanksgiving Gala in Moscow with the American Chamber of Commerce honoring Kirill Dmitriev. And it looks like part of ending the Ukraine war will be a huge inflow of Russian investment into the United States, possibly seeing this Bering Sea tunnel created and such. And so Trump has kind of an economic out when it comes to Ukraine. Venezuela, he's kind of in a situation where if he backs down, he's going to look weak. And so they're going to attack him on that. If he does something, though, it's going to be disastrous. It's not going to have good results, and it's going to isolate the United States internationally. And Maduro is going to get way more support than he would normally be getting. So with Venezuela, Trump is in a situation where there's no way out of this for him to look good. And I think that's really what a mess this is. It's not good at all.
Yeah, I don't know how you back away after putting this much military armaments in this area. I mean, well, there are a few things that are bizarre, right? Pardoning Hernandez, there's that. Drug lord from Honduras. You're pardoning him, and then you're going after Venezuela, saying that Maduro is, I guess, a drug kingpin, sending drugs to the United States. Okay, nobody believes that, right? And so these two things are happening simultaneously, which looks utterly just bizarre. On top of that, the conversation with Maduro is fascinating to me. Should Maduro walk to avoid a war?
No, because that would set a precedent that wasn't good. And I agree. At the same time, there's no reason. Maduro is wildly popular. And I keep seeing articles in the mainstream press that are bizarre. Have you seen, there's Axios and others are running claims. Well, Maduro won't leave because his Cuban handlers won't let him go, won't let him step down. Well, if that's the case, then shouldn't you be mad at Cuba? Shouldn't you have put pressure on Cuba then? They can't get their stories straight, right? The whole thing is just preposterous. Maduro is the leader of the Bolivarian movement, right? The Bolivarian movement. Where did this Venezuelan government come from? It came from during the late 80s and early 90s, Venezuela was hit with all kinds of crazy austerity. The cost of living went up. The cost of public transportation went up. You had the Caracazo, which was a huge rebellion a riot against the cost of public transportation and the cuts that were going on. And, you know, the electricity was going off because of the cuts in public spending, and the garbage wasn't being collected. And a mass movement against austerity was created, against neoliberalism was created. And the Communist Party was part of it, but so was the Catholic Church. And so were a lot of indigenous organizations and all kinds of people. And there was kind of a mass movement against cuts in public spending, and a paratrooper, a kind of populist paratrooper who was a little bit of a fringe politician until then, named Hugo Chavez, became the face of that mass movement. And he got elected. And then when he got elected, there were mudslides in the country, and he mobilized the public to go out and help the people with the mudslides. And he got on TV and he used the military to help the people with the mudslides, something that had never been done before. But this military leader used the military to help with the mudslides, built kind of a popular movement, and people were very inspired. They passed a new constitution, and he was very popular. And then they tried to overthrow him in a military coup in 2002. And the rank and file soldiers rose up and brought Hugo Chavez back to power. And at that point, they announced their goal was to create 21st century socialism. And that's where this movement comes from. And Maduro is a bus driver, a leader of the bus drivers unions, right? He's somebody who's been part of these movements for a long time. You know, a couple of years ago, I was sitting in the home of a Honduran writer that I was friends with. And I was sitting in his home, and the Venezuelan consular of New York was sitting in the home as well. We were having coffee. And I asked her about different political parties in Venezuela. And I remember I asked her, I said, what do you know about Partido Bandera Roja, or the Party of the Red Flag in Venezuela? Yeah. And she said, well, I used to be on the national committee of it. And so was Nicolas Maduro. And at that time, I didn't know who Nicolas Maduro was. I knew Hugo Chavez, who was president. I said, who's Nicolas Maduro? She said, he's the vice president, right? He's the vice president of the country. She said, now the Partido Bandera Roja is a pretty, you know, is kind of just a far left kind of isolated group. But at one point, Partido Bandera Roja, or the Party of the Red Flag, was an attempt to build a more radical communist party. And Nicolas Maduro was on the national committee of it. He was a leader of the bus drivers union. He was somebody who knew a lot about communism and had studied Marxism and had been to the Soviet Union in different places. And he was just this leader who was part of that movement. And I remember when Hugo Chavez died, many times he said, after I die, vote for Nicolas Maduro. And he made that very clear. Nicolas Maduro is my successor. And after Hugo Chavez died, the people went out and they listened to what Hugo Chavez said, and they voted for Nicolas Maduro. And, you know, I mean, there is disagreement, or was a lot of disagreement, I should say, in the Bolivarian camp after the death of Hugo Chavez. There was a feeling that the Bolivarian movement might go in different directions. But then the USA put all kinds of pressure on the country and created a food crisis in the country. And, you know, there were all these coup attempts and all that. And now Nicolas Maduro is like the symbol of Bolivarianism. They actually, it's funny, there was, you know, I would say a lot more disagreement about Maduro's leadership of Bolivarian socialism and the mass movement in Venezuela before all this happened. But now that Nicolas Maduro has become the face, and it's all about we hate Maduro, get Maduro out, now they're solidly lined up behind Maduro, actually, right? Now it's kind of like how, in various countries, I mean, you know, people always ask, you know, there's a lot of confusion about this, but like take North Korea, for example. This is a country that's technically still at war with the United States. They've been at war with the United States since the 1950s. There was an armistice, but there was never a peace treaty. The USA has no diplomatic relations with them, right? And after Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, died, they put Kim Jong-il into power. He became the new leader. Why? That was to make a statement. They said, we're still the same country. We are still the same country. Because there was all these rumors of, there's going to be market reforms, and they said they put Kim Jong-il as the leader to say we are still the same country. And then after Kim Jong-il died, they put Kim Jong-un into power. Why? To make the statement that this is still the same country, right? The lineage continues, right? Kim Il-sung was the George Washington or the Ho Chi Minh of the Korean Peninsula. He was the leader of the anti-Japanese resistance during World War II. And in the lead up to World War II, he was an outlaw, a hero, right? His name means Kim becomes the sun, right? It's like a cowboy name, right? Like the Sundance Kid or I'm trying to think of like Pretty Boy Floyd or something like that. It's an outlaw name he took on, right? It's Robin Hood. He's basically the name Kim Il-sung was the equivalent of Robin Hood, right? And he he was a legendary figure in Korea that was known for robbing the rich and giving to the poor. And he became the leader of the Korean resistance to Japan. He became the symbol of the resistance. And so after Kim Il-sung died in the early 1990s, they made Kim Jong-il the leader, and now Kim Jong-un, to make a statement that we are not surrendering and we are continuing the legacy of the revolution. That's Maduro now. Now he's the symbol of the revolution. He may not have been that in the immediate aftermath of Hugo Chavez's death. In 2015, when I visited Venezuela, there was a lot of internal turmoil in the Bolivarian camp, a lot of disagreement, a lot of people who said, well, I'm for Chavez, but I'm not for Maduro. Not anymore. Now all this pressure has been placed on them. Maduro is bad. Maduro stepped down. He's the symbol of their resistance. So Maduro is not going to step down, and they're going to continue to rally around Maduro. And the United States has really made big mistakes here. And I mean, it's unfortunate because if it wasn't for what the United States has done, the United States might have a seat at the table when it comes to Venezuela. But now at this point, the United States is acting like such a blatant aggressor and doing so in a way that they don't even have the support of Europe in doing it. That's what made Bush was very much opposed to Hugo Chavez. Obama was. And after the death of Hugo Chavez, Obama kind of rallied Europe and the international community, and they went after Venezuela. But now at this point, Trump is pretty isolated. Venezuela is getting all kinds of support. I mean, here we are. I don't see a way out of this that's going to benefit the United States internationally. I don't see a way out of this that is going to lead to a situation where the United States comes out the winner. Venezuela and Maduro are going to remain in power. The people of Venezuela will defend the revolution. The United States looks like it's in a situation where it may attack Venezuela, and as a result, it'll be further isolated.
Basically, war. And because that's what we're talking about, right? If Maduro is saying, because what this boils down to is a horrible choice. This was the Evo Morales choice. And there were a lot of people who thought Evo Morales should have stayed and defended the country, basically fight back against the fascists that were backed by the West. And that is effectively the same situation that Maduro is being put into right now. Whereas Evo Morales decided to leave, the question becomes, okay, well, what does Maduro do? Is Maduro willing to? Yeah.
There's a big difference, which is the military. The Bolivian military was the regular militaries from before the revolution. They're the ones that ousted Evo Morales. Venezuela's military is trained in Cuba. The Venezuelan military has been completely changed. It's a completely different military, and the Bolivarian movement and the military are one, right? When you join the Venezuelan army, you get socialist education. The military, I would say, is more supportive of Maduro than the rest of the country is. Whereas in Bolivia, a lot of the military wasn't. So that's the difference. And that's the whole thing. If you read Lenin, the state and revolution, that's what he talks about. I mean, ultimately, the state is bodies of armed men at the end of the day, right? That's really who has the power. And in Venezuela, the state is solidly behind Maduro and the revolution. In Bolivia, the state was not. The state was still the old state left over. You had a popular movement, and there were probably a lot of people in the military who liked Evo Morales, but a lot of the military leadership were not on his side. Sorry.
I'm curious on
Sorry to
something
interrupt.
else.
Yeah.
No, you're perfectly fine. No, great explanation for it.
Yeah.
Cuba is one of the other things that people make a point of saying, that Venezuela apparently gives oil to Cuba or sells oil to Cuba, and that going after Venezuela is a gateway and going after Cuba. Do you accept that? That seems like a lot of wood to chop to get to Cuba.
Well, no, because the reason that we saw during Obama's second term, the USA amped up sanctions like crazy on Venezuela, but then Obama went to Cuba actually and lifted a lot of sanctions on Cuba, opened a U.S. embassy in Cuba. What was going on is that for a long time, especially like in the 70s and 80s, Cuba was viewed as the center of anti-imperialism in South and Central America, right? It was exporting the Cuban Revolution all over the region. All these rebel groups were getting support from Cuba. That's why Cuba was designated as a state sponsor of terror, because they were supporting various, movements that were fighting military dictatorships in Colombia and places like that. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas were fighting, an actual U.S.-backed dictator, and they took power, right? And they were backed by Cuba. And but at this point, Venezuela is on the South American continent, and they have a huge amount of oil, and they are playing a much more important role. Cuba used to be kind of the fountainhead of anti-imperialism. Now Venezuela is. Cuba was no longer seen as much of a threat by the United States because they don't have oil and they're not actually on the South American continent. Venezuela was seen as much more of a threat. And that, the USA felt like, okay, well, Cuba, they have certain weaknesses, right? They have certain vulnerabilities because they depend on imports of oil, because, they produce their own food, but they have, limitations of products they have to import, whereas Venezuela is more of a threat. So, yeah, I just, the role that Cuba used to play in the 70s and 80s is now being played by Venezuela.
I see. So it's not about Cuba, it's about Venezuela specifically. No. Basically, that's the issue.
Yeah, Venezuela is more central, I think, at this point. Venezuela, if you look at in terms of the economy, in terms of where they're positioned, in terms of spreading anti-imperialism throughout the region, Venezuela is the target, not Cuba. Cuba has helped Venezuela, and Cuba has provided, especially in military matters, right? The Cuban military is really important. And let's just point this out. This is one thing they're never bringing up. What country has the most effective anti-drug policies of all of Latin America? Cuba, right? Cuba has no drug problem at all, according to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency. So, I mean, if there's any argument for Venezuela not being a fountainhead of the drug issue, it's the fact that they're so close to Cuba, right? And that they have Cuban troops there, that they work with the Cubans. I mean, Cuba has no drug problem. And the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency and other officials have marveled at how effective Cuba's anti-drug policies are. There is no drug problem in Cuba because they have a society. They have social safety net. I mean, they have full employment. They have guaranteed health care. They have all of that. And on top of that, the military and the government and community organizations very effectively mobilize. The whole country is kind of unified in getting rid of the drug problem. There was a lot of drugs in Cuba before the revolution, and they completely got rid of it. In the early 90s, one of Fidel Castro's top generals was caught sitting down with drug cartels, and he actually was executed and got the death penalty in the 90s. And that was a really shocking moment. This was somebody who'd been like a founder of Cuba, and he was executed for drugs. And many people suspected that the USA was going to try and use drugs as an excuse to attack Cuba. And so to preempt that, Fidel executed one of his top generals who was sitting down with the drug dealers. Wow. And that was pretty wild. And this is, again, I do not understand this at all, right? We're legalizing marijuana. Marijuana is legal like all over the United States right now. The American public is against the war on drugs. The American people are not sitting down there saying, all right, let's invade some countries to deal with drugs. The opioid epidemic is certainly something that has devastated a lot of communities. But there's no one sitting there saying, all right, let's get Venezuela because they got some drugs. I mean, why is he using drugs to sell this? Like, this is weird. It's not a PR victory. I mean, no one's sitting there. It's like, with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, I understood it because 9/11 had just happened. They were scaring us all. There's going to be more 9/11s. We're all going to die. But I mean, who is sitting there saying, all right, there's too much cocaine and weed in my neighborhood, let's invade Venezuela? No one's saying that. Like, no one is saying that. There are a lot of people in, like, I guess you could say Trump country, red states, who've seen the impact of fentanyl in their country. But no one is saying fentanyl is coming from Venezuela. Fentanyl comes from Mexico. Fentanyl, fentanyl, it's synthetically created. You just have to have certain chemicals and you can make it. Most of it's made in the United States. They just get the chemicals from somewhere else. So, I mean, it's weird that they're even selling it this way. It's almost like they're trying to sell the war not to Americans and the U.S. public, but to like people within the state, like deep state actors who are horrified by what drug cartels do, or maybe like people in South America. Maybe there's like certain people, like, military people in South and Central America really hate the drug cartels. Like, they're trying to sell it to them, but it's not the American people and it's not the international community. It's weird. It's very, very weird. They're using the drug issue here. This is really strange marketing. I mean, I must say, it's like, it's not winning them any public relations points.
Well, I think it's hubris of a hegemon. Like, they think that the American public would accept them going after Maduro, and they just need a thin fig leaf to do it. Meaning we get that this is nonsense. We get it. We don't care. It's nonsense. But we're going to sell it using this fig leaf nonetheless. That's what it comes across as. I mean, I'm not sure. Look, there's some rando out there that believes this. I don't doubt it. Yeah. Like, there's going to be 5% of the population that says Donald Trump is fighting drugs by going after Maduro. I suspect a lot of people, though, look at it as Maduro's a bad guy, Maduro's a dictator. So if you remove Maduro, that's okay. Meaning, I don't know if it's heavier than that. It's that shallow where the public just kind of sits back and accepts. I mean, granted, Hegseth apparently is getting pressure because apparently the double tap that murdered those fishermen. Okay, well, that is amazing to me by itself, right? For one, the idea that you attack those fishermen or the people who were in those boats is outrageous by itself. But then they're saying, well, the first strike is okay, but the fact that you hit it the second time, that's what we take issue with. What? Like, first strike wasn't okay. If you had the capacity to use military force in order to murder somebody in the boat, then you had also the military capacity to capture the person in a boat and capture the person with the drugs and prosecute. They are making an intentional display to murder the various people who are in those boats. Yeah, it's just wild to me. I understand your point. Your point is like this is one of the dumbest excuses that you would use to create some kind of regime change mechanism, and yet they're using it. And I guess my thing is, this seems to just be hubris.
And it's outdated. It's like in the late 80s, this was kind of a talking point. Noriega, right? The invasion of Panama, they used drugs as the excuse, right? And that was the age of just say no. You're my age, right? You remember just say no. You remember all that bullshit, right? I remember
that. Doing in schools. Yeah.
I will never forget. We had an anti-drug speaker came to our school, and he put up an image on the screen of Madame Curie, right? The chemist, right? And he said, Madame Curie, she was not allowed in the National Academy of Sciences. Does anyone know why? This girl in the front row raises her hand. Because she did drugs? No, not because she did drugs. And someone else, because she's a woman? He's like, exactly. He's like, Madame Curie was not allowed in the National Academy of Sciences, but did she join a gang? No. Did she use drugs? No. All right. So neither can you. I remember sitting there and thinking,
what?
There you go. Yeah, exactly. Right. It's like, so there you go. Madame Curie, she didn't join a gang. She didn't use drugs. So neither should you. Right. That was just say no. That was,
that's so dumb.
Extremely. So dumb. It's extremely dumb. Yes. That was dare. I mean, if any of us who grew up with that, I mean, it was so dumb. It was just.
That.
Yeah,
I remember that. They used to do it in school. Nancy Reagan, just say no. That was a whole pitch. The DARE program in our middle school. Oh, God, man. I remember that stuff. That stuff was ubiquitous. It was all over the place. It obviously failed because marijuana is legal.
Yeah.
At the point in many of these states. Yeah. So from your point of view, this is going to be a war for all intents and purposes. I don't know how Trump backs out. I don't know how you save face and backs out. Maduro doesn't seem like he's going to leave, which he shouldn't. I mean, God, man, this is always a dichotomy because it's, okay, either you step down or you put your country through a war. Neither one of those are good solutions in the situation. And yet the war seems to be the thing where you have to defend the sovereignty of your state. I don't know another way out, frankly. I mean, maybe I'm missing something.
I mean, I assume that there's probably at least one faction of the Trump administration that is thinking like, how can we strike and say we did, but do the least damage as possible? Kind of like what they did with Syria. And you remember after the chemical weapons attack, allegedly, right in Syria,
Obama,
right? When Trump was in during the first term, like he blew up an empty airport, and then he was like, all right, I got him. Like there was that, right? It might be something like that. I'm curious.
I mean, he's effectively said that he's put him on the foreign terrorist organization list, Venezuela. And so it's like, okay, so you did a strike. Maduro's still in power. And then you have all of this military hardware that is in the Caribbean. You've been training troops in Puerto Rico who's been going through this jungle warfare stuff. And without accomplishing any of your objectives, you now pull out. How do you save face with that? See, that's the issue, right? It's you've hyped this thing up for the last several months, including up into murder.
Yeah, well,
and it's like, how do you back away?
There's an element, like you saw in the reports, like Trump wanted Maduro to come to the United States, right? You saw that, right?
That would be outrageous.
Right.
That would be outrageous. There's no way.
Maduro was like, no, I'm not going to do that because you've got a bounty out for me. I'll be arrested. And it's like on some level, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And apparently that was part of the goal of the conversation. Was Trump was like, I want you to come to the United States and we'll have a photo op together and all of this. And Venezuela was like, well, no, if you come to the United States, I'm going to be arrested. And like part of the Trump administration was hoping to get a photo op out of this. And the other half of the Trump administration is hoping for a regime change war. Like, this is bizarre. And I mean, the idea that that was even discussed, like you do realize, like, you put a huge bounty on this guy's head. He's charged with all kinds of crimes and all this, but yet Trump is like, got the fantasy of like, well, maybe he can come to America and we can shake hands and take pictures together. And I'll go down in history as I mean, on some level, they don't even know what they're doing. Right. I mean, and it's like, there's people in the Trump administration with very divergent goals. Let me put it that way. Right. Let me put it that way. The fact that that would even be on the table, that anyone would even be talking about that at this point, it's like they don't know the circumstances. There's people, there's people on the White House team who are not familiar with the international circumstances and are just thinking in terms of public relations. There are people on the White House team that are just thinking in terms of international relations and are tied in with this Miami mafia that doesn't care about anything but regime change and fighting the Latin American left and fighting anyone who's aligned with Cuba. I'm seeing a lot of incompetence here. That's what I'm seeing.
What about other South American states? I mean, Colombia, Petro has been very loud in this. I guess all of them on some level know that any invasion of Venezuela is also some kind of exertion of power by the United States and the various other countries, not just Venezuela in and of itself. And the other thing is control. Like the moment that you invade Venezuela, either through airstrikes, trying to depose Maduro and everything else, what does the country look like at that point? Like, meaning you've fundamentally unraveled a society on some level the moment that you attack the country. That has to factor into the calculus, or does it from your point of view?
I mean, look at Honduras. In 2009, that was Obama's first coup. Obama had just come into office, and the Hillary Clinton State Department, without talking to Obama, had been talking with Micheletti and the generals in Honduras, and they overthrew the Honduran president, Manuel Zelaya, and brought in chaos and death and destruction. And Honduras had, I believe it still has, one of the highest murder rates in the world. It's right up there with Haiti. And it was absolutely devastating. And what was wild about that coup is that Obama didn't seem to know what was going on. They asked Obama about it at a press conference, like right after it happened. And he said, well, that's not legal. You can't overthrow the government. And then, he was quickly told, oh, well, actually, we support the overthrow of the government. He didn't even really know what was going on. It was all Hillary Clinton who arranged the whole thing. Had been planning it since before Obama even took office. She'd been in touch with the generals and such, and she came into the State Department and it was planned, and Obama didn't even know about it. And that was the Honduras coup. And that led to drug cartel insanity, chaos, all kinds of stuff. And Honduras has been having problems. And now I see Trump, speaking, he's interfering in Venezuela or in Honduran politics now. He's, taking sides and talking about who's who. And, and it's like, let's look at the situation in Honduras. Honduras would be a much more stable country, if it wasn't for the fact that the USA violently overthrew the government and installed a chaos narco drug regime there in 2009. So, I mean, that's what set the stage for all of this, and that there is a mass social movement in Honduras that was against the coup that is backing up various anti-imperialists that are there. And, during Obama's term, during Obama's presidency, he did, like, in Honduras and in Guatemala, they had two like fake revolutions where it was like the whole government stepped down and the people were out in the streets because of corruption and nothing changed. But it was like to make a statement, they had everyone go out and rebel, and it was all this. And then it was just like, see, we're coming together against corruption. The other thing they did in Guatemala is they put, the former military dictator, from Guatemala, Rios Montt, they put him on trial for, massacring indigenous people. And they had a public trial for him, where he was found guilty of genocide. And then they, let him off on a technicality. But it was very much a public relations stunt. It was to let the indigenous folks know, like, we hear you, we've heard you, we understand the horrendous things that were done to you in the 1980s, right?
Yeah.
And there was a lot of efforts by the US-backed organizations and Soros-backed organizations to have like truth and reconciliation and kind of look like, you know, the population of Guatemala that suffered horrendously during the period of the military dictatorship, that they've been heard, that the crimes against them are being acknowledged. They really were trying to preempt something like Bolivarianism taking power in Honduras and Guatemala. And so Obama's whole thing was, you know, let's, you know, we'll put Rios Montt on trial. We'll have a fake revolution. We'll do all of this to make sure that they don't, you know, have a straight up, you know, a real revolutionary movement. And that was kind of what was going on there. And that people even put the Pope's left turn in with that, right? The Pope, who was in office at the time, he was, you know, kind of talking about, you know, criticizing capitalism and having sentiments, you know, for the migrants, and the Pope kind of took a left turn, and that was to kind of keep the Catholic Church in its position because, and this is where it gets really wild, in the 1980s, the Catholic Church was kind of sympathetic to some of the anti-colonial movements. The Nicaraguan, you know, the Sandinistas had priests that were in the government and such, and it was Catholics, you know, that were protesting in the United States against the USA sending weapons to death squads in El Salvador and such. And it was the School of the Americas, which was the military CIA training, that tended to be all evangelicals, right? Evangelicals who thought the Catholic Church was, you know, had lost its way or was in bed with communism or whatever. And you know, the massacres of priests and nuns and all of that. Now in Latin America, it's kind of flipped. There are a lot of local Pentecostal ministers in Nicaragua and in Venezuela who are pro-Bolivarian. And that's something we don't know about in the United States. But, you know, the Pentecostal church and a lot of the Protestant churches, there's no like hierarchy. They don't have to get permission from the Vatican. So the local minister sees that his congregation, their wages are going up. You know, they're getting health care. They've got guaranteed jobs. They're paving new roads in the neighborhood. And he says, you know, this looks good to me. And he likes the Bolivarian government. There are a lot of ministers and pastors from the Protestant, like kind of Protestant fundamentalist tradition now in Venezuela and in Nicaragua that are supportive of the socialist governments there. Whereas the Catholic Church is now very solidly opposed. The Catholic Church was very involved in trying to destabilize Nicaragua. In Venezuela, the majority of the country is Catholic, but the Catholic Church is very anti-Maduro. And so it's kind of interesting to see how it's flipped, you know. And so now, and that's one thing I was kind of blown away when I was in Venezuela in 2015. There are a lot of, you know, religious, you know, fanatical religious Protestants, I guess you could say, Pentecostals, Baptists, and others that are big supporters of Maduro. And you wouldn't know that. That just doesn't fit what we know about American politics. But, you know, gay marriage is not legal in Venezuela. Abortion is not legal in Venezuela. And, you know, it's quite a socially conservative country. Their socialism is very conservative, and religion is a really big part of the communist ideology there. That's one thing that I saw when I was in Caracas, is talking to the communists. It all gets back to, this is what Jesus would want. This is, we're fighting for the downtrodden. We're fighting for the oppressed. You know, I mean, yeah, you know, there's a very, very religious overtone to the Marxist ideology that you hear from Bolivarian Marxists in Nicaragua and in Venezuela. You know, the official slogan of the Sandinistas, the slogan that they have painted everywhere, it's like the official government slogan is Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. You know, yeah, and you wouldn't know that, right? But it's because of, you know, because those countries are very, very Catholic historically, and because of liberation theology in the 1980s and all of that, the anti-imperialist like Marxism is very, very, very religious in the way it presents itself.
The way it feels. Last question. What do you make of something like Syrian takeover, where let's say the CIA gets involved, pays off military in order to, let's say, create an overthrow internally? I mean, because that's effectively what took place in Syria, right? You get all of this money that are flowing to various, let's say, military generals. You get threats that may be leveled at some of them. Some of them stand down in regards to fighting the war. Basically, you create a cancer from within in order to undercut the government itself. Or do you think the Bolivarian, let's say, ideological basis is resistant to that in a way that the Syrian government?
Well, the problem, the big difference is in Syria, you had an armed opposition army that was very, very big, right? That could lay the basis for kind of a new state. In Venezuela, you don't have that, and as I pointed out before, the Venezuelan military is more supportive and more ideologically in support of Maduro than before. And there have been many coup attempts, and they just don't go through. There's nobody to carry out a coup. They've tried that. I mean, they've tried that before. So, you know, an actual invasion where they fought the Venezuelan state, I mean, that would be an absolute disaster, but that could happen. Airstrikes, I mean, I think that's what it looks like is going to happen according to the reports that we're getting now. I really hope that that is wrong somehow. I really hope that there's a change, you know, but it seems like that's what is, all the signs seem to be pointing toward, with the closing of the airspace, and now where Russian tourists are being evacuated. It looks like the USA is planning some kind of airstrike. That's what the Pentagon has said. I really hope that they don't do that. But that's kind of the situation we're in, and it's an absolute disaster. But I also, though, you have to remember Venezuela and Russia are quite close, and the United States and Russia are negotiating around the clock, right? And that factors into these
part of the negotiations. Yeah, I guess that's a good point. This may come up in negotiations. Caleb, great breakdown as always, man. I swear to God. Caleb Maupin, he's a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, author. He's director of CPI, Center for Political Innovation. Caleb, let the audience know some of your books. Sure. He's a prolific writer. Caleb writes all the time. Let him.
The Danger of an American Years of Lead. I don't know if you saw, but starting December 1st today, every member of Congress is now going to get $20,000 for their personal security. Did you see that?
I did not see that. Really?
Yeah. In July, it was $5,000. In September, they made it $10,000. Now today, $20,000 for personal security every month. Right?
Imagine being that unpopular.
Yeah, because there's so much political violence now, with Charlie Kirk, with the assassinations that have happened, with Marjorie Taylor Greene stepping down. Political violence in the United States is on the rise. I view this as an intelligence strategy, and I compare it to the Years of Lead in Italy. So people should read what I wrote. I wrote this long before Charlie Kirk was killed. I wrote this about the Luigi Mangione case, and what I predicted was basically that we're going to see an upsurge of political violence as a way to control the narrative. And I wrote this book, and it's more true than I understood what was going on, and then it turns out to be even more true than I realized. So yeah, there you go. Check it out. The Danger of an American Years of Lead.
Caleb Maupin. Caleb, you have a fantastic rest of your day, man. Thank you for this. You be safe, okay?
You too. Thanks.
Have a good one. Caleb, great breakdown by Caleb. Great breakdown. We have come to the end. We've come to the end. Let's go to chats before we close it. Kevin Wayne, BBC, quote, U.S. lawmakers demand answers over Hegseth Venezuela boat strike claims, unquote. That's laughable. I'm sorry, it's laughable. Like, and I don't mean laughable in a positive way. I mean it in the most dramatic, negative way that I can think of. They have murdered like 80 people in boats. Boats, by the way, that couldn't even get to the United States in many respects. Boats that, if you have a military strength that's in the Caribbean, you can apprehend, capture, get the drugs, and prosecute. In one of the cases, or maybe even more, they destroyed a boat. The people lived, they captured the people, and then released the people because people were effectively innocent. And so you have a double tap on a boat where they hit a boat illegally and then hit it again in order to make sure that the people were murdered. It goes to Trump. Trump is like, I don't know anything about it. And even distances himself from Hegseth, effectively saying, hey, look, I don't believe in murdering people if they can't fight, etc. Hegseth releases the statement, hey, we're not in the business of just murdering people if they can't fight. Well, none of these people can fight. You're in a fishing boat and they blow up the boat. So even the very premise that Hegseth is running with of, well, we're not in the business of attacking people who can't necessarily defend themselves. Well, you were attacking people who couldn't defend themselves, and we're effectively just murdering civilians and innocent people. There's that. They don't take issue with the murders. They take issue with the fact that it was a double tap. What the hell, right? How do you not take issue with the basis by which Trump is doing this? As opposed to taking issue with, well, you blew up the boat, that's fair game, but the fact that you murdered the people after you blew up the boat and the people were still alive, that's what we take issue with. It's like, are you being serious? you being serious right now? So yeah, they're claiming that they're looking into it in an investigation. I won't hold my breath. I won't hold my breath. I put it that way. Aether, what is it? Blue? Aether Blue. Welcome to the family. Welcome to the family. Welcome to the family. President Jafar, Donald Trump is calling Maduro a narco terrorist while pardoning narco president from Honduras. Ain't that some shit? Ain't that some shit? Trump wants to reestablish drug lines in South America. Who says those drug lines were ever gotten rid of? President Jafar. I mean, keep in mind that CIA was drug running at one point. And I mean, at this point, I think it's just well known that CIA was drug running. Yeah, pardoning Hernandez. Pardoning Hernandez. Like I said, ain't that some shit? Ain't that some shit? The single tap was bad enough. Yeah, Alexandra Black. Yes, that's the part that should have been illegal, right? The African American guy who stepped down, he stepped down because it was illegal, and he understood it was illegal, right? If indeed Trump is correct, you have a massive military contingent in the Caribbean. You have speedboats that would have to be refueled like 8 times in order to get to the United States. I don't know who the hell is going to be in a speedboat going all the way to the US, but whatever. Any of these people could be apprehended. Any of them can be apprehended. You have an overwhelming amount of force in this situation. But that's not what they're doing. And it's not what they're doing because they know that they're lying through their teeth about it. So there's that. All right. We've reached the end. We've reached the end. Guys, I always tell you, you can support this content. You can like the video. You can share the video. You can support this content, especially if you find yourself coming back here often and you dig what we are putting down on a daily basis. Through PayPal, Patreon, Super Chat, Buy Me a Coffee, memberships. Shout out to Aether Blue. Welcome to the family on that one. Super stickers. I don't know why they have super stickers and super chats. I don't know the difference between those things, with the exception of leaving comments, but whatever. Both of those things are available. All of those things help support the work. All of those things help support the content. I really want to get a producer, and part of that requires growth and assistance from the show itself. So, but I'm going to call us a day. I want to thank all of you for joining me. Tomorrow, Margaret Kimberly is going to be on the show. Laith Maruth is going to be on tomorrow since he wasn't on Friday. And I'm trying to get John Helmer to break down the Witkoff Putin meeting that's supposed to take place tomorrow. So we'll see. Hopefully he's responded to me by now. Oh, by the way, I'm going to be on Revolutionary Blackout Network in the morning. Well, it's my morning, your evening. It's going to be at 7:45, 7:30. It's going to be at 7:30 tomorrow on Revolutionary Blackout Network. I'm saying tomorrow because it's tomorrow for me. It's in the morning for me. It's an evening for you guys. So it's going to be 7:45 Eastern, or 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. For me, it's 6 in the morning. So that should be badass. I don't think I've ever been on their show, to be honest. So it'll be an experience. But you all have a fantastic rest of your day. I'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning. Have a good one all. Be safe and be kind to the degree. Look, I know I quantify that because I feel it's more honest to say to the degree that you can be kind. That's why I quantify it. But be safe and be kind to the degree that you could be kind. Don't be a doormat. You guys have a fantastic rest of your day. Have a good one all. Thank you for joining.